Hey everyone, we are now recording episode 3 of How to Live Morally Without Free Will. And we're just going to jump right into it and pick up where we left off, which is the topic of evolutionary intuitionism.
Yeah, so intuitions, that's a complicated word to start off with, but just to kind of address it a little bit. They do studies where they test people's moral conclusions, right? So they'll give you a piece of paper and they'll say, hey, if you encounter this scenario, what do you think is the correct moral response, right? A, B, C, or D, fill in the blank, whatever. So they test people's intuitions, right? When you do like a test on paper, that's more of a cognitive moral intuition, right? You're calculating, you're thinking, prefrontal cortex stuff. But then what they find is that they can do a different type of test where they throw you into an environment and you immediately have to assess the situation, and you're running out of time and you have to respond. And so that's more of a gut response. You don't have time to calculate and think. And what they find is often the moral response, the intuition of your gut is different from your intuition on paper. So when I say evolutionary intuitionism, I'm kind of referring to that gut morality. It's like the thousands, millions of years of evolution. It's kind of programming us with a gut response, right? And so when we're trying to think through morality, it's like, well, evolution, it's been aiming at, like existence, survival, reproduction, social cohesion. It's trying to give us some intuitions that promote these evolutionary principles. And so the evolutionary intuition stance is that we can trust our evolutionary intuitions. They're trying to do what's good. And so whatever they give us is good, right? You can critique that stance and say, evolution, it's dumb. Evolution doesn't really optimize very well. It does like the bare minimum. You can say that evolution, it was optimizing for historical contexts, and evolution might be optimizing for harmful context as well. So there's a lot of ways to critique evolutionary intuitionism, right? But there's also like some value there. It's like, like evolution, it kind of gives us a lot of what we call morality. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about that tension between our evolutionary feelings and the problems associated therewith?
It is complex. It's important to recognize the role of tension and the fact that we can't ever have all this figured out. And I think this is where laws come in, because we can't all agree on them, or we can't all just go off of evolutionary instinct to make decisions and just behave on the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, or sympathetic nervous system. So we have laws, we have moral values. I mean, maybe there's a hierarchy of that as well. Like maybe laws come first, and then your family morals and your religious morals and personal ideology, that comes under that. I mean, that's kind of why we vote, right? Like we all have our own laws, or we have our own values and virtues and everything and morals, and we kind of vote to bring cohesion to that and put our feelings forth in that regard, and hopefully the majority of people's feelings are served in that manner.
Right. So yeah, that's an interesting point. Is like within evolution, you're going to get variety, right? So like there could be a variety of moral intuitions. You could get the psychopath who has, crazy moral intuitions that nobody agrees with. Mm-hmm. You could have all these types of varieties, but one principle of evolution is that the more reliable, the more sturdy, like the more important something is, the more ingrained it is, the more universal it is. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
So, for example, like an intuition, thou shalt not murder, right? That type of a moral intuition, it seems like a human universal. You go anywhere in the world, everyone seems to have the intuition, you don't kill innocent people for fun, right? That's just wrong. Everyone agrees with that. And that would be like, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, like what food should we eat? Some religions, they say pork is bad. Another religion, they say, well, coffee and tea are bad. Like diet is not a core principle to our survival.
Right.
But like whether or not you murder people, like if everyone is murdering, your society just disappears. It's just self-destruction. And so like the only way to exist is if we just agree no murdering, right? And so that's like a core principle to our survival strategy. Does that so it's universal because it's so necessary.
Right. Yeah. And there are certain laws where you start to see those parallels across different nations, and that's a pretty common one. Is the
Right.
laws against taking a human life.
Right. So there's kind of this evolutionary argument that the more universal something is, the more correct it is morally. Because the reason why it's universal is because it has succeeded in accomplishing the goal of our evolutionary morality, right?
Right. So this is kind of like leading into this topic of moral synthesism, where we're trying to synthesize natural evolutionary instincts and evolutionary morals, if you want to use that term, and what we want to bring into the world today.
Right. Moral synthesism. It's the generic underlying principle is that there's a lot of perspectives on morality, and like you should consider whether or not there's something valid about all of them. Because like maybe the best moral theory is an integrated constellation, right? It's like we're incorporating a lot of things from all of these moral theories. So the moral synthesism, the perfect theory, brings everything together. That's the general idea. And when we think about how our brains work, we don't operate purely on gut instinct. You know what I mean? Like our prefrontal cortex does a lot of cognition. It does a lot of thinking, right? We can change our minds. Like we can have a gut feeling, right? And then our cognition says, well, nah. And so like our own brains are doing this dialectic, right? So the dialectic produces synthesis. Moral synthesism, we got to do this dialectic. So it's like we've got these contradictions. It's like my gut says I'm really angry and I just want to like punch a hole in the wall. And then my cognition says, I got to think from their perspective. I got to think about the future. I really don't want to repair the hole in the wall. It's like it's better if I just regulate my emotions and move past this. You know what I mean? So we're balancing the present with the future. We're balancing our own perspective with other people's perspective. And so I think our cognition is a very valuable tool to help us augment these gut feelings. So I don't think we should just trust our gut completely. We have to synthesize the gut, right? We have to be able to measure when is the gut correct and when is the gut incorrect. And then that's when we synthesize. We say, okay, if it's correct, we bring it in. If it's incorrect, we keep it out. You know what I mean? That's the type of theory we need.
Totally. And this is getting into the psychology of it. This is made easier through various therapies and through meditation. It seems like meditations and the mantras are probably the best bet in that regard, because you can start out with certain unhelpful evolutionary instincts, and through therapy and through training, through forms of repetition, that trains your prefrontal cortex to have these reactions more instinctively, where you don't have to bring your prefrontal cortex online and the neocortex. You don't have to involve so much top-down management and your urge to punch the wall, because you just won't have the urge to punch the wall in the first place. That requires radical paradigm shifts, but it can be done.
Yeah, I believe that for sure. That makes this whole argument more complex, because to the extent your gut can be trained, then the gut is less connected to evolution and it's more connected to personal development. And so then the moral question becomes, how do we manage this personal development? Our brain is a series of synaptic augmentations where we're growing this pathway and we're reducing this pathway, right? It's like maybe evolution gives us a default pathway, And then our development, over time we weaken and prune. We're pruning our moral pathways, perhaps. And so that highlights how important environment is to all of this. And there's a lot of hopefulness, right? So the premise of this series of videos is, how can we be moral without free will? And the power of environment is one of the most hopeful aspects, right? So it's like the environment is part of the causal chain that controls us, right? But the hopeful thing is the environment is flexible. We can change our environment. We can change the media we watch. We can change the people we interact with. We can change our hobbies. We can change like everything in environment. The art, we can bring in art into our environment that inspires us. We can do so many things to change our environment, and that will have a causal effect on us, right? So basically, the environment controls us, but we control the environment, so we can control our own development, right?
Right. And some people would call that free will, or they'd call that a sense of agency, I would say. Is the agent is now realizing that it can alter its environment for its own self-benefit. And that's incredibly important. Also, you touched on even using this word gut and gut instinct, and I just want to make the point that there are 2 million neurons in the gut. You have actual brain cells throughout your entire gut. And so taking on the agency to change your diet to a healthy diet will also improve your attitude. And also eating at the right times and becoming mindful of when you're hungry. Like the studies that Sapolsky and people use showing how judges, when a judge in a court of law is hungry, they'll get hangry and they'll make worse decisions in that regard.
More harsh.
Or more harsh,
Yeah.
And that's there's all the factors that you can take account for. You really want to. This is another thing I try to spread messages about when it comes to psychology.
Right.
As many influencing factors as you can account for, you want to try and do that.
Yeah, a lot of it it kind of connects to mindfulness. There's this concept of metacognition, which you want to develop the ability to monitor yourself, right? If you just go through the world unthinking, right? You're just following your gut all the time. You're not. You have less ability to control yourself, right? The metacognition, there's kind of a feedback loop. It's where you do something, and then a part of your brain watches what you're doing, and then evaluates it and says, "Am I happy with what I'm doing?" And then if not, it can go in and regulate it and say, "Hey, let's tweak some things." You know what I mean? And so if you're wanting more agency, if you're wanting more control, if you're wanting to push yourself in a more moral direction, you want to develop that part of your brain that's watching, that metacognition. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And to me, that's the most foundational property of all therapy. Without that, it's much harder to make other forms of therapy work. This is why I'm still a proponent of cognitive behavioral therapy and the mindfulness-based, awareness-based properties there. So you can think of virtues and values and morals as kind of a system of frameworks or a system of anchor points that you can develop so that you don't have to use so much metacognition. You have to activate the metacognition to set those into place and to learn the lessons while you're learning these therapies and just which values and virtues that you want to adhere to. But having those as kind of guiding lights or as anchor points for your cognition kind of takes the burden off of the metacognition. And this is all metabolic efficiency. This is all your brain trying to conserve energy and operate it at a resilient and efficient method. And so when you establish these anchor points, that kind of takes that metabolic energy dispersal out of the picture. So it's
Right.
We translate that as being naturally drawn towards the good, or sophersin. This is the Greek form of sophersin, is forming a way to be naturally drawn towards good, as opposed to the opposite, as being drawn towards evil.
Yeah, that's pretty huge. There's another interesting thing about the evolutionary intuitionism thing. So remember, with the synthesism, we have to know when evolution goes wrong, right? So I think one thing that you focus on a lot is really useful here, which is like biases, right? So evolution, it's trying to be inexpensive, like it's trying to be efficient with resources. So part of the problem with morality is it's very complex, right?
Right.
Like every single moral problem is a very complex calculation, and we don't like complexity. It's inefficient, it's costly. Our brain, it burns up a lot of energy. And so if we can have biases, if we can have heuristics, if we can have cognitive shortcuts, we can bypass a lot of cognition, and we can just jump to this conclusion, probably good enough, right? But we have to be wary of that. Like, yes, it's efficient. Yes, it's cheaper in terms of energy cost, but you're going to be more inaccurate. So if the goal is accuracy, we have to slow down, watch out for the biases. It's like, hey, let's rethink this without the biases. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think your video turned off.
Yeah. Battery died. Yeah. So
do you want to pause the recording? Or oh, you're back.
Yeah, this camera has tiny batteries. It's unfortunate. Yeah, so that is synthesism. That's going about it through a synthetic process, like you're trying to synthesize these ideas and guide yourself in a way that's in alignment with your own values and those of others.
Right. The synthesis, it has to take the antithesis seriously. Right. The antithesis is the counter argument. So the thesis is we can trust what evolution gives us in terms of morality. And then the antithesis is no, because XYZ evolution is flawed. Right. So the synthesis, we got to respect all of those counter arguments and address them before we get to the conclusion. You know what I mean?
Right. That's yeah. So Socrates gets at this. Socrates says that no one knowingly does wrong, and so this is where we get into kind of this natural ignorance idea, the lack of free will causing us to not make the best decisions, I guess you could say. And this is why I tend to just give people grace. Like, there's this term, unconditional loving kindness or unconditional positive regard. And I think if you come at unconditional positive regard from this standpoint of people lacking in free will, that makes it a lot easier. I have a lot of writing on this, actually, and we've talked about that a bit in the past as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this is, like, often the religious perspective, at least, you know, the kind of Christian perspective I'm familiar with, there's kind of this black and white thinking. It's like, oh, there's like these righteous people, and then there's these evil people. And these evil people, they just want to sin. They just want to do bad things. They want to do wrong. And like Socrates was just completely opposed to that. He's like, that doesn't make sense. Why would an agent do something that is bad? Like, agents, the whole point of being an agent is to make good actions that accomplish your goal. Like, why would you do something that's bad for your own goals? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, there's counter arguments, like you could say, like, well, there's short-sighted goals, and then there's long-term goals. And so you could say maybe there's an agent, he's really short-sighted, and he's like, oh, I'm going to starve, and I have the short-sighted goal, and so, like, I need to maintain my existence, so I need to steal some food so that I can keep existing, and I'm just very short-term thinking. So, like, from the agent's perspective, stealing the food is good because it's accomplishing their short-term goal, right? But from the society's perspective, no, that's wrong. You're harming society, you're increasing crime, you're creating cycles of revenge, cycles of violence. It's like, hey, we got to find a better way than this, right?
That's why we use the term selfish. They're behaving selfishly because it's all about the self versus the society and the self.
Exactly. So the Socrates perspective, no one knowingly does wrong. Well, it's like, what is the scope of wrongness? Is the wrongness like wrong against yourself, or is the scope the wrongness against society? So I think people do the wrong thing against society, but nobody ever does the wrong thing against themselves. Does that make sense?
Right, because their evolution set them up with the self-first perspective, where their primary goal is survival, and that bleeds into the taking advantage of others, manipulation. I mean, I also attribute a lot of what we think of as conscious manipulation as actually a form of unconsciousness as well. Like, if they were more conscious or more aware, or if they had these virtues and values and morals as anchor points in their decision-making process, they would be able to make those better decisions.
Right. So this stuff is really complicated. So I hope so. We should just give it some nuance, just because it deserves the nuance. So in the brain, there is a place called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
Right. That's the society area, or like where you interact with decision-making involved in relations with others. VM.
Yes, yeah. So
VMPC.
What I've learned about the VMPC is that it's kind of located right behind the eyes. There's kind of a sphere of the VMPC. The VMPC, from my understanding, it manages kind of like your moral agency, like moral decision making. It manages your identity. So like, who am I, and like what things am I doing? So like, that's agency, right? I am the type of creature that does the good thing. That's the VMPC. And then also it's really interesting. It's almost like half of the VMPC does selfish logic, and the other half does selfless logic. And so it's like the VMPC is fighting against itself. It's like there's a dialectic going on. It's like, we should be selfish. And then the other says, no, we should be selfless. And they're fighting. And then the conclusion is what we do. The what we do pops out the front or whatever. So the thing is, within psychology, you can measure like the big 5 personality traits. You can measure different people. Different people are more or less disagreeable, right? So you could kind of say the disagreeable people, their selfish part of their brain is stronger, and the agreeable people, the selfless part of the brain is stronger, right? So when they fight, the two parts fight, the selfless side wins more, or the selfish side wins more, and it's a percentage. So it's like, maybe this side wins 60% of the time, maybe it wins 80% of the time. And so there's a spectrum of how humans operate in the world, right? So basically, from my perspective, if you're the type of person where your brain chooses to be agreeable 80% of the time, that means your brain has decided selfless behavior is good 80% of the time. That's how your brain operates. You think that selfless behavior is good. And then conversely, a disagreeable brain, they're disagreeable 60% of the time. That's what their brain thinks is good. So it goes back to Socrates. No one knowingly does wrong. When the person is disagreeable, they think disagreeability is good. So does that make sense?
Right. It's kind of like when people identify as a contrarian, and you can do, well, as a personal example, I have a friend that's been a very close friend for about a decade, and he identifies as a contrarian, and he has done a lot of good with that. We've had probably thousands of hours of conversation because we're both good at thinking in contrary forms, but reeling it back. But it also can cause problems, and I've witnessed that in him as well, where he struggles to reel that back correctly. And I'm afraid that's because he consumes drugs and uses alcohol, and that lowers your metacognition in a way. Another point I wanted to make about this is when you look at the psychology of what we see in the West with diagnoses like dissociative identity disorder, this you could say that that is occurring in the VMPC, where you see this wrestling with personality or wrestling with identity, and that kind of dissolving, or where you feel a disorientation in that regard. And that's such an important process to develop. That's such an important aspect of yourself, is yourself, like who you're going to identify as. What is the consistent, relatively consistent form of personality that you want to keep through time as you flow with the river, and as you grow, and as you improve that persona and personality as you go on through time. And that involves the ego. But again, to do the typical critical criticization of psychology today in the West, we see the neuroaffirmative care model, where the idea is that we're affirming the way the brain is right now because that's your lived experience, and we want to respect and validate your lived experience first and foremost, instead of giving you tools to alter that or improve that. And that's very problematic. But it leads, like, I imagine what's happening with the brain in that regard is that it's not, like, when you think of the brain as settling and kind of reaching out through its black box to understand the world that it occupies, it will latch on to that way of viewing the world and think, I don't have to exercise my VMPC. I don't have to really develop those regions of the brain anymore, because I now have an ideology and a set of virtues and values and a moral structure that's been dictated to me through Western universities to guide myself, and now I will demand other people accommodate that, and I don't have to respect them, I don't have to try. And of course this gets very extreme, like those cases where there's like zero respect, or where people are completely operating from a selfish perspective. That's not as common as many conservative traditionalists perhaps would like to think of that, but this does happen, and this is one thing I'm kind of concerned about.
It's that's one of the problems with evolution, is you get variety, and there's a spectrum of these traits. If you get way too far in the disagreeable territory, that's when you just disagree with all of society and you just commit crime, right?
Right. Or view society as sick, like as Jiddu Krishnamurti put it. There's it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. I know people personally that operate from that standpoint, and I've watched them remain stagnant and remain, for lack of a better word, a victim of their reality, and not willing to try and associate with other friends, or not make new friends that might be better for them, despite having heard many times the phrase, you are the 5 people that you hang around the most. And I do fear for that, because determinism in this regard, taking away the idea of freely willed agency, or the idea of having agency and the ability to improve yourself and improve your society, that can take you away from that when you're operating from a wholly deterministic standpoint. And the brain seems to love that, because that's metabolically efficient. Like, we also evolved to do that. We talked about this term leaning on the tribe, where you probably have the alpha male, alpha chimp, or whatever, and the shaman, the doctor and the shaman that you go to for your morals and virtues and for healing purposes, and perhaps a few other leaders in the hunter-gatherer tribe. And then you have the brain kind of leaning on their efforts, and I might try to take some of the scraps from the hunt, because I don't want to put forth the effort to hunt, and I'm just going to live off of those scraps. Those mechanisms are still deeply set in us, hundreds of thousands of years old. And I fear it's very easy to slip into that when you're given a linguistic formula for that, because we also operate through this symbolic representation system, where we attach language to symbolic meaning, and we use those words to kind of arrive at those systems of living, and we justify our behaviors and our bad behaviors from that system of reasoning without fully questioning it. Language bewitches us, and we are bewitched by language, as Wittgenstein put it.
That I read a study that scared me. I had a hard time finding it a second time, so definitely fact check me on this one. But it was basically something to the effect of, when people are listening to an authority, like, the skeptical part of their brain turns off.
Oh
Like the
yeah,
prefrontal cortex is often like that skeptical part that filters the information. And like it was the results of the study were like, yeah, that part of their brain, it just like turns off and they're just like absorbing, just let the authority, tell me what to do kind of a thing. So
absolutely.
that's an efficient thing. Like for evolutionary purposes, it's like our society is more efficient if we all just follow the authority. Like stop creating social tension and let's all just work together. But at the same time, you have to be careful of evolution because, like, what if the authority is wrong? Like, maybe we need some pushback, right?
Absolutely. And the better spoken the person is, the more charisma they have, the easier it is to fall into what they're saying. It's
Yeah.
axiomatic reasoning as well. Like if you can pinpoint certain axioms or pinpoint certain
Mm-hmm.
starting points, and it sounds like you have a good foundational understanding of this starting point, and you connect that to another starting point, and you connect it to another one, then you start to build this world model, and the listener will think, oh wow, yeah, that sounds really good. And this is exactly what you see with Hitler. This is exactly what Hitler did. He learned how to, that's cognizant manipulation. That's conscious and guilty manipulation, in my opinion. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of red flags to watch out in that tribalism department. Like anytime, like for me, the biggest red flag is when authorities are comparing other groups of humans to, if they're comparing them to bugs, to rodents, to viruses, to plagues, like like
Oh yeah.
bugs, rodents, it's basic, like the metaphor, right? It's a metaphor. The metaphor is they are so disgusting and harmful that they need to be eradicated. That's the metaphor. It's like
Right.
that's a really dangerous metaphor. Don't do that. Like, you know what
And
I mean?
that's the rhetoric that Donald J. Trump uses constantly. That's exactly what he's tapping into. And I said this is full of conscious guilt, but I don't think he's wholly conscious of that either. He needs to be held accountable by that. That's what I mean by saying that. And this again goes to that's symbolic
Yeah.
representation, and that's the symbolic representation of the bug as the gross, ugly thing that triggers the insular cortex disgust responses, and we attach the language of rodent or cockroach to that, and yeah, I mean this goes. You can see this in the language of exclusion as well, like when we see the us versus them, and like this is my tribe versus this is them. The barbarian, the term barbarian originates from the Vikings using this term to describe anyone that didn't speak the language that they spoke. They said that everything that they're saying sounds like bar 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 bar, and so
I
so
love it.
that's where the term barbarian came from. And similar to beyond the pale, like we I don't use that phrase anymore because I learned this a while back. Anyone that came from beyond the pale fog was an outsider, and so that the concepts that come from beyond the pale are also
Hmm.
gross and unreasonable because that's not us. That's the outgroup, as it were.
I learned a different explanation for Beyond the Pale.
Oh, really?
The one that I learned was that Pale is a location in Scotland, I believe, or Ireland, and the English would invade Ireland, and usually they would only invade the coast. And Ireland, they were used to it, so like, okay, whatever, you invaded the coast, what's new? But a deeper part of Ireland was called the Pale, and like if they invaded past the Pale, it pissed off the Irish, because they're like, hey man, it's one thing to invade the coast, but if you're invading past the Pale, now you're really pissing us off. You know what I
Right.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting how etymology works. They're probably got mixed up over time with that. ChatGPT says you're right though. That's probably from the Pale in Ireland. So
Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah. I could talk about that for a long time, but let's move it along here. Uh, so regarding antisocial behavior, um, so we debated talking about this before we went in here, but we get into the abstract a lot, and I think it's good to use concrete examples. For example, the recent attempts on, or the recent killing of the CEO of the American healthcare Association. Is that it? I think it's
United
or
Healthcare.
United. Yeah, United Healthcare. This
Yeah.
was Luigi Maggioni, I think. I forget his last name.
Right.
So that's very anti-social. I think that's a lot of people have tried to justify it. Just to give my 2 cents and just to try to avoid YouTube throwing up any red flags here or whatever. My perspective on this is murder is murder. We try to justify it by saying that this is for the good, but there's no escaping the wrongness of taking another human life in any circumstance. Religions try to justify it. A lot of what you see in the ideologies and political ideologies on Facebook land and social media, you'll see a lot of people celebrating this, and I'm disgusted by that. I think it's absolutely horrible. This man had a family. He had a wife and kids. He may have chosen the wrong career, one of the worst careers you could possibly choose, but of course he did not deserve to have his life taken for that.
Yeah, yeah. I think I largely agree with that. But like, I guess from an ethics, from an evolutionary intuition standpoint, the quest for synthesism is understanding the pitfalls of what evolution is giving us, right? And so I guess Luigi, is that his name?
That's right.
Yeah, Luigi is an example, perhaps, of the pitfalls of these evolutionary biases. I think I like to call this problem the is. I mean, there's a logical deduction aspect to morality that I want to talk about. So I'm going to introduce this deductive paradigm and then tie it back and see what you think. So Hume, David Hume, he was an English philosopher. He coined the Hume's guillotine as the is-ought gap, or the is-ought distinction, right? You're familiar with that one, right?
Oh yeah.
I'll just flesh it out for the audience, of course. But basically, he says that, like, he has a really fun quote. He basically says, I'm reading someone talk about morality, and they go on, and they're like, this is the case, and this is the case, and this is the case, and then at the very end they say, and this is what we ought to do about it. And I'm constantly flabbergasted because, well, where did that ought come from? As far as I can see, there's all these is clauses, and then out of nowhere comes this ought statement. And so people have interpreted Hume as saying, you can't go from an is to an ought. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people resonate with that. It's like, well, just because something is the case, like I think the intuition behind it is it's an invalid deduction, right? So if you think about logical deductions, you've got premises and you've got conclusions. So you could say, like, the premise one, what's a good? I hope this doesn't violate YouTube's policies, but whatever, we're going here. So it's like, person A murdered an innocent person, right? That's a fact. This person murdered this person. And now, like, and now my life is in danger. Like, I'm the next person. Like, I'm in danger. Like, it is a fact that I'm in danger to this person. I'm receiving, I'm in danger. So then the conclusion is, well, I ought to act in self-defense, right? But logically, that doesn't make sense, because the problem is you need a meta-ought, right? Meta-ought, like, on my YouTube channel, I think I coined the phrase meta-ought. I've never heard it elsewhere. So, like, meta is like a higher order thing. So it's like the conclusion is what we ought to do, but where does that conclusion come from? We need a deeper ought. So the deeper ought is, if your life is in danger, you ought to act in self-defense. So It's like, once you build this deeper logic, it's like, okay, if we're in danger, we ought to act in self-defense. Now the fact is, I am in danger, and so now we have a valid conclusion. I ought to act in self-defense. So the is-ought gap is solved by creating a meta-ought, right? But then the problem is we start to argue about the meta-oughts, right? It's like, well, If we're in danger, we ought to act in self-defense. Well, are we sure about that? And like, then we vote. It's like, okay, everyone agrees.
Right.
Everyone agrees with the meta-ought, and so now we have a law, right? If the meta-ought gets into the law. But like often people go deeper and they say, well, I disagree with your meta-ought, and that gets into the whole meta-ethical debate. So we've got this moral logic, meta-ought, and then we've got a fact or an is statement, and then we've got a conclusion. Let's tie this back to Luigi, right? Luigi, he's got this meta-ought of if people are corrupt, if people are super corrupt and harming others systemically, they ought to die. They ought to be, people ought to be murdered if they are just corrupt and harming others. And then in Luigi's mind, he's got a fact. He's got a fact that this CEO, he is corrupt and harming others like crazy. And so in Luigi's mind, he's got all the logic he needs.
Right.
The meta-ought, it's okay to murder corrupt people. And it's in his mind, it's a fact that this guy is corrupt. Therefore, I've got my conclusion. I know what I ought to do. You know what I mean?
And he took the leap in that regard. He took a big leap, and he had to pay the consequences. And so that meta-ought that we agree on, like that's the primary law that we all abide by, is that thou shalt not kill. And so, yeah, that happened. And
right.
now he's in prison.
Yeah, and so he was operating on his own meta-ought, right? In society, we have the meta-ought that, like, if someone is corrupt and harming others, you ought to take them to court and prove it, and then let the justice system punish them. You don't take it into your own hands. Like, that's not that's not the meta-ought of society.
You can think of like a personal meta-ought versus a societal meta-ought in that way. This is like virtues and values and moral structure. You can use that language. And the personal moral structure, or just the word perspective comes to mind.
Right.
But I guess perspective is a little bit different there, because that's also updating, and your perspective can be altered with better exposure to better people. Perhaps if Luigi had better friends, or if he were in a better law system that encouraged teaching morals in the school, which we absolutely do not do in the United States, and that would have helped him. And so, to point this out, the YouTube algorithms and the YouTube system is also operating on this ideally virtuous and proper meta-ought, where if they're using algorithms for this, but they're programming those algorithms to catch for these words like murder or kill, and by using them, I'm already probably contributing to triggering that. So I hope it understands that. But the designers are using these algorithms to try to prevent encouraging bad messages and giving people bad ideas. And as these systems improve through artificial intelligence, they'll be able to catch the nuances in what we're discussing here and realize in a way that this is a message of proper behavior, and giving a description of why people do the bad things that they do and how to improve behavior in this regard, because this is absolutely unacceptable. Again, killing in self-defense, that's a completely different story, and that's why we have that debated in a court of law. What is self-defense and what is not? But my point in bringing this up is some of the debates I've had on Facebook about this, where people kind of equate those two things. Like, they try to say that this is exactly that. What Luigi did was killing in self-defense because his family or his friends were being directly attacked. Yeah, he used the word attack. Like, they were being attacked by the healthcare system. And I was trying to explain that that's not the case. Now, I definitely feel strongly about that. I'm $137,000 in debt because of the messed up healthcare system that we have here. But I'm certainly not going to try and hurt anyone because of that. I'm going to try to use my words for good to spread better messages and change the system with my vote and whatever else I can do that's in my power within reason without doing any harm. Again, this whole golden rule, treat others as you'd want to be treated. The simple one is do no harm. Do no harm to yourself or to others, physically or psychologically. If we were just to teach that, like if that meta-ought were a foundational perspective that we're taught to children, we would be in such a better place, I think. And it's so easy. Like, who's going to disagree with that message?
So in this deductive paradigm of morality that I've established, there are two issues that should be, immediately obvious. So, and we've already touched on it a little bit. So, like, one problem is, I call it the ought problem of morality, and what I'm referring to is the meta-ought. So maybe I should call it the meta-ought problem of morality. That's probably more accurate, because we have to agree on our meta-ought, and so if we have the wrong meta-ought, we mess up our moral conclusion. So the meta-ought problem of morality is that it's very important to get the meta-ought correctly. If you have the meta-ought incorrect, then your entire morality is problematic. So we have to constantly debate this and try to refine our meta-oughts. And it can get worse, because meta-oughts might be established on a meta-ought, and so then you start going deeper and deeper into your moral theory, layer upon layer. What this meta-ought has this behind it, this meta has this behind it. So there's a lot of moral debate to do. That's the meta-ought problem of morality. The other one is the is problem of morality, right? So our moral conclusion, it's based on a conjunction. Our meta-ought and the facts are coming together. If you get your facts wrong, you mess up your moral conclusion, right? So, like, what if the CEO, he was like the least corrupt of all CEOs? It was like you completely messed up your conclusion. Like, he's not even corrupt in the first place. So you're not justified in, even with your own bad meta-ought, your is wrong. You know what I mean? And so you have to get both of them correct. You can't be punishing innocent people.
Right. And there's also, it seems like, especially in Luigi's case, there was a misunderstanding of the overarching is. So he got the fact right that, yes, it is the case that their healthcare system ranks 28th in the world, and it manipulates its people and exploits them and commodifies humans. And he thought he ought to do this horrible act, but he forgot the secondary is there, that it is the fact that there will be incredibly bad consequences if you do that. And he kind of neglected that final is there. Or maybe I'm just playing games with words, but
yeah, I mean, I simplified morality into like premise 1, premise 2, and conclusion. But really, like, reality is not as simple as 3 clauses. Like, there's multiple interacting premises and multiple facts. Like, there's a constellation of logic that all comes together to a conclusion. So I think you're 100% right that there's multiple facts going on that lead to this. So, but the point is, epistemology is extremely important. If you get your epistemology is how we figure out what's a fact. If we get our facts wrong, if we get our epistemology wrong, we will accidentally become bad people, right? You can't have a good conclusion with bad facts.
Right.
And so some people think, oh, well, I'm just going to be a good person and I don't care about the facts. It's like, no, you're actually a bad person if you have all the wrong facts. You know what I mean?
Right. And so you could also say living authentically or living through your lived experience is being a good person, when your lived experience is actually absolute shit, and you should try and improve it, because you're going to make bad actions if you don't. You're going to try to be a freedom fighter or start a revolution, and you think that you're doing right, but that's actually not the case. It is as wrong as it could possibly be. But you use the word accidentally there. Like, again, this is so unconscious. And immediately when we start talking like that, it sounds like we're justifying it to people that don't really have this deeper understanding of determinism and the very small amount of self-control that we seem to have until we're taught to gain better self-control. And so much of that involves learning all of these perspectives so that you can have more control in these overarching perspectives and all of the ises.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, you mentioned revolution, and I think that's a really important point, because, I think that there seems to be lots of there's lots of voices that are trying to get us to distrust authority, to view our society as corrupt everywhere. And if you think about, if you embody the mindset of my society is evil, my society is corrupt, like all these facts, right? It's like you're absorbing these facts. Everywhere I look is corruption. Everywhere I look is evil. It's like that's a recipe for like creating a revolution mentality. You know what I mean? It's like you get this meta-ought. If my society is corrupt, I ought to revolt. My society is corrupt, therefore, time for the revolution. You know what I mean? And so that's why getting both of the oughts right and getting the is right, it's so essential for getting the right conclusion.
Absolutely. This is aligning with society, finding a good agent-arena relationship.
Right.
So we want to try to earn a better epistemic vetting of the data. That's, I guess that's one way to put that. Like your epistemology and your understanding of the world requires you to filter data from many perspectives and in a nuanced fashion. But when your whole ideology is based on avoiding nuance and just gravitating towards what feels right or what your emotions are telling you first, then that can get you into problems quickly.
Yeah, for sure, man. Better. So yeah, this is problem. There's just like, we have to figure out how to refine our epistemology. We've got to learn more. We got to vet the data. We've got to look for biases and fallacies and errors in our reasoning. We got to incorporate more perspectives, deeper empathy. There's lots of epistemic tools that we can try to incorporate to get better at this, but it's a lot of effort, and people are lazy, as we already discussed. So it's kind of hard, and so we have to constantly, we got to be the environment, right? We got to push each other to push ourselves to try harder, because it's so essential. You get the is wrong, you become a bad person, whether you like it or not.
Right. That's a teaching process, and you're not going to change the brain just by direct punishment. And this is so we have to have some form of punishment. The prison system, like to use Luigi as an example again, if you just lock him up for 20 years or 30 years or whatever, that's like the spanking mechanism, or that's like the beating and punching attitude of training organic organisms, which, yeah, that works. That's actually the main mechanism that natural selection left us with, is the red in tooth and claw perspective, where you have all these pain sensors and you have the conception of negativity in the direction of your life and all that, and natural selection teaches you the hard way not to do this, not to bump into the trees, not to get cut or whatever, and not to put yourself in situations where your society will lock you away. Those are very similar to me. The more modern and very effective way to correct a person is to give them the tools to become a better person. But you do at the same time have to take them away from society, so you still have to put them in prison, and probably for an extended period, because it's going to take a few good years for them to really make this transformation where they won't make the ultimate mistake of hurting someone, or make the intentional action, I should say, of hurting someone. You want to give them a better setup to make a better set of intentions with their life. Right. That requires a lot of therapy. And this is what's so sad, man. Prison therapy is a joke. This is the case for most countries, and especially here. We have what I call the vengeance mindset, where we celebrate other people's defeats. It's kind of or celebrate other people's punishment. It's Schadenfreude, and this is exemplified in how we used to have crowds where we go to see the hanging, like the weekend hangings where you'd bring your children in the medieval ages, and
it's crazy.
Just in the past few decades,
not even.
I mean, just in the past few decades, we have the electric chair, where people would sit in freaking benches like bleachers that you'd see at a stadium, and they just all gather together. Let's eat some popcorn and watch this person get fried. And man, I mean, that's so gross and despicable to me, like that. But of course, we have to have some form of actual punishment that's consequences to the action as a deterrent from people doing these things. But if you don't match that with therapy, if you don't match that with something that's going to change this person, then the only option is just to continue to keep them locked up for the rest of their lives, which is also not fair. That's hypocritical in my way of thinking.
Yeah,
because you wouldn't want that, right? Like if you were locked up, you wouldn't want that. You'd want to have options to live in society as a normal person and improve yourself. A lot of people that commit these atrocities come to regret them, not just for the fact that they had the consequences, but because they want to live a better life. Most of the time people are indeed making mistakes or just not fully thinking through what they're doing, even in this case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say here. Like, first of all, like from a free will standpoint, like at first glance, like the no free will perspective is like, well, they didn't have a choice in the first place, so like, why are you locking them up? So then the question is, well, why do we lock people up in the context of no free will? And like what it should be is like you're trying to minimize harm. So the question is, what policy minimizes collective harm, right? If so, like measuring something like recidivism. Recidivism is the idea that they're going to repeat their crime in the future. So it's like if we release them out of prison, are they going to go cause more harm? That's a question. And so then the question is, well, can we do things like therapy, or like is there like I forget the word. Rehabilitation. Can we do something like rehabilitation to reduce recidivism? That reduces the harm. So it's like if we can get rid of the problem, that's awesome, right? Like then so we're minimizing the harm to the individual and we're minimizing harm to society, right? So that's kind of how I run through these calculations. What do you think?
Totally. This brings to mind the movie with Morgan Freeman, and he's in prison, Shawshank Redemption, where they continue to ask him after like 20 years, have you been rehabilitated? Do you consider yourself rehabilitated now? And of course he's like, you just taught me how to be secluded from society. I didn't learn anything here. Eventually he says that, and it's yeah, I mean, you're not teaching anybody anything there. In fact, you're teaching them to adapt to a horribly corrupt system and live in fear, which may be worsening their anxieties and their paranoia. You know. Let me let my dog out really quick, or let her in really quick.
Okay.
Okay.
So, okay. So there's another really important thing to say about prison reform and whatnot. My understanding is that the threat of a prison sentence does not do very much by way of, goddamn, what's the word? Prevention, like preventing crime. Ideally, yeah, it's not a deterrent. Ideally, the goal is you want to scare people away from crime. It's like, oh, if you do bad things, jail, and they're like, okay, I won't do bad things, and society is happy. But my understanding is that in order to care about the future, you have to have you have to be in a mindset that is not focused on the present. And my understanding is that when people have a mindset focused on the future, they don't commit crimes to begin with. Like future-oriented people are not committing crimes. So the threat of jail is a future-oriented fear. And so it only works on the people who are focused on the future, and they already don't commit crime. It's the people who are focused on the present that are committing the crimes. And so a future-oriented threat is not going to work. And so it doesn't even accomplish that goal in the first place. So like, I guess if you're trying to go for a prevention policy, what you're gonna want one of two things. You're gonna want like a threat that works in the present, like scary security guards or something, or you want to build a society that is friendly to all of its citizens to help pull people out of a present mindset. So like, if
Right.
people are living on the fringes of society, if they're starving, if they can't get health care, if their kids can't get to school, like if you have like a society that makes some of your citizens have horrible lives, that is going to put them in a present oriented mindset. So you got to build
Yeah.
a more friendly society to bring people into that future mindset.
Totally. Yeah, and this is extremely easy to adopt that mindset to where it's not so much a fixed mindset, it's just our ability to think and plan years ahead. That's not as strong as we'd like it to be. Perhaps evolution set us up to have those as biases as well, where we're working together with smaller goals to promote our little tribe and get it to work towards the future, and eventually we'll see each other again in heaven or something like that, and or Valhalla or whatever it is, and and so there's different values at play there. But yeah, I mean, I highly doubt that hunter gatherers were thinking about what they're going to be planning to do in the next 20 years. You know, I don't think that they were. I mean, maybe maybe that's another one where it's kind of leaning on the tribe mechanism, where you have some people and some brains that evolved to make those bigger thoughts and to plan cities and make better huts and civilizations, or smaller civilizations, and then those complexified over time. And then other people kind of saw that and they're like, yeah, that sounds right. I want to do that. I'm not going to dedicate the mental resources towards contemplating that at that level. I'm going to trust what he said. He's got the charisma as well. He's got the, also expresses himself well and shows that he's good at handling tools and can build and all. He's proven himself as a good leader, and I'm going to trust that. And maybe that's why we struggle so much, is because we don't all have that. Maybe only some people have that more stronger than others. That being said, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of the life coaching, in fact, is centered around that, is bestowing this idea in people and instilling that capacity for long-term future planning. Yeah, so I do very strongly believe that we can develop that as a capacity,
Yeah.
or at least enhance that capacity.
Right. But yeah, it's so interesting that all of these factors, all of these, we're talking about so much stuff, but it's like, it's all part of the puzzle of determinism, right? Like,
Right.
this is your society, this is your environment. Your environment is programming your mindset. If you have this, this shitty environment, you get this more present-oriented mentality. Better environment, more future-oriented mentality. It's chains of cause and effect.
Right.
And so when we understand the flow, when we understand the cause and effect, we have the tools, like, okay, well, we can change the environment. We can vote and change everything. So it's a feedback loop of like, now that we understand the cause and effect, we can become the cause to create the better effect. Like, that's the beauty of determinism. Like, some people have this, they hate determinism. They're like, oh, we're just a slave and we can't change anything. And it's like, well, actually, understanding determinism empowers you so much more.
Absolutely. It shows you the faults that you have. It shows you how easily swayed you are and how beholden to your own brain you can be. And if you don't do something about that, then you will have wasted your life. You will end up doing actions, behaviors that you regret, end up saying things that you regret. And it requires a lot of training and conscious agency to better that process, better your understanding of the world.
Yeah.
It's honing your epistemic frame.
Essential. So there's a topic here that I kind of want to address, which is creating versus discovering values. Yeah, so like I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about it. I thought it was a really interesting insight, which was he said something to the effect of like, Nietzsche's whole perspective was that this Ubermensch, this Superman, he can just like invent his own meta-aughts, right? He's like, oh yeah, I don't need to listen to society. I just create my own meta-aughts and do what I want. You know what I mean? And Jordan Peterson's criticism was that you don't create your own values. And so I think there's something to this. And so like, basically, we're not blank slates, right? We're not just like an empty piece of paper that you can write whatever values you want on that piece of paper. Like, you can't just, you can't just write anything on a piece of paper and say, okay, I value that now. Like, we're not that flexible. And so this is the value of the meta-aught perspective. Jordan Peterson says he thinks that we discover our values. And so I think that this discovery perspective is useful and insightful, because what it is like, we often think at the superficial level. It's like, well, I like this type of music, I like this type of art, I like these types of people. And then like, well, the discovery is you go deeper. And this is a philosophic exercise. Why? Why do I like this art? Why do I like this music? Why do I like these people? Right? And there's like, well, there's some common traits. And then you ask it again, you go deeper. Why do I like these common traits? And you eventually get to some core principles, and that's the core of who you are as an agent. You have these core values, those are your meta-aughts. And like, once you discover those deep, deep, deep meta-aughts within you, that can be like a source of meaning to guide you. It's like, wow, I like all of these things because, in a nuanced way, they're benefiting society. And, I really want society to be better. Like, my deepest core value is like, I want the future to be better. I was like, wow, that's such an inspiring thing to discover. And then that can like guide your future determinism. It's like, I know who I am as an agent, and so now I can organize my life. How do I make actions to accomplish this meta-aught deep within me? I'm going to get this job because it satisfies this core value. And I'm going to take this hobby because it satisfies this core value. And suddenly your life is full of meaning. Despite determinism, despite no free will, because you've discovered something deep, it just opens up so much for you.
Right. That's kind of like developing those anchor points that I mentioned earlier. Like you're determining your future based on those anchor points. I also, a couple years ago, I was reflecting deeply on how this feels in my own brain to navigate my own cognition when thinking and doing different forms of cognition and mentation. When I'm thinking long-term, what's relevant to your society's needs and well-being.
Yep, we have to synthesize, right? That's kind of my underlying principle is we've got to balance everything together. There's actually an interesting point I was discussing with a friend the other day. So one of my friends was saying, well, if we're trying to build the most perfect moral theory, how do we do that? Because it's so damn complex. There's so many factors.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think there's an analogy to artificial intelligence, right? So within these language models, within neural networks, what's going on is basically there's like a bunch of nodes. So like think of like a tapestry of little software nodes. And you can think of a software node as like a little tiny algorithm that has a little bit of data. Okay, so these nodes are calculating probabilities. Okay, so imagine like we're doing AI artwork. And so we've got like this, we're trying to make an image. Let's just say for some simplicity's sake, we have 1,000 pixels. Okay, so each pixel, we've got to determine what color we're going to use. And we've got little nodes that are doing probability calculations. So let's imagine a blanket of 1,000 nodes. Each node is trying to do calculate the probability for the color for the pixel. Okay, so now we give this AI a goal. We say, let's make an image of a dog. Okay, now how does it know to balance out all the colors to make a dog? This is a complicated problem, right? Sometimes in some contexts we need a little bit of red, some harshness. In another context we need some green, some softness. Sometimes we need blue, sometimes we need purple, sometimes we need white, sometimes there's all of these there's lower level goals, like we have a goal of redness, we have a goal of brownness, right? So we have we have a multiplicity of goals, and then we have the meta goal, make a dog, right? And so that, when it comes to the moral project, the meta goal, evolutionary, harmonious existence, and then we have all these micro goals. It's we have my personal needs. I mean, we have a suite of personal needs, like Maslow's hierarchy, and then my family has a suite of needs, and my tribe has a suite of needs, and my society has a suite of needs, and other nations have a suite of needs, and the environment has a suite of needs. It's holy hell, we have to balance all of that somehow. But the beauty is AI figures out how to balance all the variables, right? It trains and trains and trains, and it slowly learns probabilistically, in this context, in this corner of the screen, we need a little bit of tail. And then in this context, we need a little bit of nose and a little bit of eyeball. And in this context, we need a little bit of foot. And algorithmically, there's a possibility to balance all the variables, right? And so maybe there's hope of a symbiosis with AI. Maybe we're not good enough at it, but maybe we can harmonize our moral systems, and maybe AI can help us balance all of these diverse needs.
Man, yeah, you're speaking my language too. I really try to, I think about this a lot, and I try not to promote this too much because there's so much, I have a lot of hesitancy trusting AI as a world governance operator in any regard, but also a lot of other people do as well, and they tend to shut down when I mention anything close to that. But I think that's probably where society is going to head. I think that we're going to have to go that direction by necessity. It's a little off topic, but we're going to actually talk about this tomorrow in tomorrow's meeting, the Polymath Park meeting.
Nice.
So I'm glad you're bringing this up. So the example of AI is really, that's very apt. I think that there's a lot of relevance here. The gradient descent process, you're talking about gradient descent, where it trains on all these images, and it kind of creates so there's different ways for you to do that. You can also completely prompt through a large language model, I want this to be this is what a dog is, but an AI doesn't realize what a dog is, it's just doing it. That's kind of what we're doing with society too. We don't really completely understand what we're going at, and maybe we shouldn't use words like communism or socialism or capitalism, because that immediately triggers people to use that word. It really is this ongoing social experiment that we ought to be working together in. That is an ought, I think, useful ought there to use that word, but that's what we're doing, and we don't exactly know what the process is when we get there. But what AI is doing with image recognition, so the point there that I think is relevant is that it doesn't completely get it right. When you look at the dog and the image there, it's yeah, that's a dog, but if I were to take a picture of a dog with a 4K photo or whatever, it would be much sharper, or if I were to get a video, it would be much cleaner. But of course, as you add more details, as you add more of these nodes, as your prompting gets better and more refined, as you add more and more variables, it does much, much better. And now we're getting to the point where, we can't tell the difference. So that's a really good metaphor. I think that is kind of how this is going to work, because we struggle to hold all those variables. We can't. Our brains are not evolved for that, but we can create these brains, these artificial or alternative intelligences, to all those plates spinning and to come to better conclusions than what we are. And also to check our bias. So this is another point I'm making in the group is it's better to use them to check our biases than to have them do decisions for us, or to create models for us. Right now, that's the case, I think, because we are horrible with managing our own biases. We gravitate toward, because of necessity, this is how we evolved. Our brain is not evolved to constantly be battling cognitive dissonance. This is why I try to emphasize this as a theme in this channel, is nuance is the key. Nuance and humility, that's going to allow this cognitive dissonance to be much more comfortable for you. You'll have less friends, but that's where you start to make better friends. You can also make friends that are more nuanced and deep thinkers, and that's going to be better for you in the end. You'll lose a lot of friends in the process of growth.
Yeah.
You have to become comfortable with that as you go to change, and as you begin to have more control over your brain and question your own biases, you'll be leading a life of more control. But the trick there, the balance with that, is also not to completely question all of your biases and question all your virtues all the time, or you'll never have any moral structure or any kind of overarching philosophy to live under. Your epistemological frame will be compromised.
Yeah, sometimes you have to eat some costs to get the benefit on the other side. That's the future-oriented thinking. You know,
Precisely.
take a cost now to get a better result in the future.
Absolutely. So let's talk about Stoicism a bit. You want to bring up this idea of just like focus on what you can control. This is the locus of control. Radical acceptance for what you can't control. You can't change the past, but you can control your environment, control your future.
Yeah, I think a Stoicism perspective, like, is in my experience, like, it was the most powerful thing for reducing my anxiety. I mean, as like a teenager, I was like really anxious about schooling, getting good grades, you know, worried about homework, worried about, you know, future, you know, stuff like that. And like, you know, in church, I learned a Stoic perspective, which was basically like, do your best, and, you know, that's the best you can do, and just, you know, have faith that God will take care of the rest. So that's kind of a Stoic mentality, and like that really comforted and reduced my anxiety. I was like, you know, I studied my ass off. If I get a bad score, well, that's what's meant to be, because I can't do more than what I'm already doing. My best is my best. You know what I mean? So that was very helpful for like my mental health growing up.
Wish I had been taught that. I had to learn those values in my late 20s. That's unfortunate. Or learned like control. I was very much beholden to my own anxiety. I had to be taught online. So yeah,
it's interesting. I think Vervaeke calls these psychotechnologies.
Yeah,
it's like it's a simple piece of logic. It goes into your brain, and then suddenly your anxiety is gone. It's like, wow, like, forget the pills, give me the Stoicism.
that's awesome. You remember that term, and I don't hear anybody else using the word psychotechnologies, but I also use that a lot now. That's cool.
Yeah.
Another example of that he gives is humans, like other people, are psychotechnologies for your betterment. There's some quote that's other people are mirrors to your unconscious, I think.
Yeah, interesting.
Because, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, you get feedback, and your openness to be receptive towards feedback from others, that's that mirror effect. That's your ability to see parts of yourself that you didn't recognize. And again, going back to this whole criticizing of psychology in the West, or at least today's modern conceptions of psychology in many universities, we're teaching people to think of the self first, think of my lived experience, and, well, to be specific, using the term rejection sensitive dysphoria. If you give people that language, their symbolic representation system, their symbolic understanding of themselves will gravitate towards that, and they might become defensive and reject all forms of feedback, completely nullifying the concept of the psychotechnology and becoming a person in a fixed mindset. And that's so unfortunate, because I see that I've lived that before, and I see it in some of my friends now too. And it's so hard to encourage people, because they're living under that paradigm where you have this very rich, detailed language of this. Many books have been written on this, of today's, I mean, we could just call it postmodern psychology. And I'm wary of using that term, because that's exactly the way that Peterson talks about it. And Peterson is coming from the angle of, all y'all need to just suck it up, life is hard, pull up your bootstraps. And I don't mean to sum up his work in that regard, but that's a large way that he goes about this, and it's unfortunate because it's far more complex than that, and that's also a very callous perspective. It's a very it doesn't get the message across, and also it's the wrong message. Like, you can't just pull yourself up by your bootstraps constantly, or you'll hit burnout. And
that perspective doesn't appreciate determinism.
Exactly.
It's like, oh yeah, like, just will yourself to be better. What?
Right.
Like,
But
like, there's chains of cause and effect. You need to, in order to, man up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you must have the causal chains that allow you to do that. If you don't have the right causal chains, you can't do that.
And the other end of determinism is the very much mechanistic meat machine determinism aspect of postmodern psychology that says you have the RSD, therefore you cannot accept rejection. Your brain will always default to gastrointestinal stress. You will have nervous farts when people start to reject you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're completely beholden to your brain. And I mean, this is the way that Sapolsky is teaching this, and Sapolsky has millions and millions of viewers, and I'm afraid that many of his videos have contributed to that as well. As much as I love his work, and as much as I've learned, I have to call that out when I see it, because I don't think he realizes that that's what he's doing. He's just being a good behavioral psychologist, or a human behavioral biologist is the series that this is most prominent in. But yeah, so there are many factors at play. Like, I just meant to bring that up to say that it's not just the universities. That's Stanford University, but Stanford University also has a lot of very good evolutionary psychologists that think in different ways about this. They think in the agency, promotion, and growth mindset.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's complex, but I think you're right to be wary of that overly rigid determinism that takes away agency. I think it's good to. It's kind of like you've got like the naive free willers who are like, oh, we can just choose anything, and they've got the Sapolskys that are like, no, you're wrong. You're fixed into these problems. And I think probably
dictates you. Yeah.
And it might be like maybe Sapolsky, he suffers with depression. Like, maybe he feels fixed into his depression. You know what I mean? But it goes into this growth mindset perspective. Is like that it's like, my understanding is that the growth mindset is so much more healthier for your psychology, and it gives you so much better results into the world. So the growth mindset, it's like, you got to like transcend the fixed mindset of like, oh, I'm stuck in these deterministic ruts. It's like, no, like, even with determinism, we can grow, we can change, we can develop. And to be fair to Sapolsky, I have heard him, sometimes he emphasizes this more growth, agental perspective, but I think sometimes he downplays it too. So I guess it's worth trying to emphasize the growth mindset.
Absolutely. That's and I've read a lot of his work as well. I've read 2 of his books. I read Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which helped explain how my Crohn's disease works, and I read his recent book, Determined. And when he's pressed on this, sometimes he does tend to just say, well, I'm not a philosopher, and that's kind of the problem. A lot like what Greg Henriquez is talking about on his channel right now is the role of philosophy in psychology that's absent. It's very, very absent. It's more about this deterministic aspect where you have countless studies and you have so much data showing that your glucocorticoids will increase when you are stressed, but you don't have nearly as much data showing that when you start these behavioral practices, or when you start the growth mindset practices and mindfulness, and taking account of all of the holistic perspectives of the psychodynamic process, you will reverse that. You'll have less gastrointestinal stress and glucocorticoid production.
And what triggered the reduction?
Well, that's kind of what I'm saying. There's many, many factors there. It's this whole psychodynamic perspective where it's your diet, your sleep, your exercise, your meaning structure, as Vervaeke's talking about with the meaning crisis, your relationships, again, going back to the 5 people that you hang around the most. Your reality is constantly influencing you. And so as much agency as you can take with that, That's what needs to be pursued. And that immediately starts to sound like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's all about just resilience and being calloused to the world. And so that's the grind culture bros latch onto that. The grind culture is all about that. And so they reach burnout and they get stuck in this having mode where it's like, I got to just reward myself constantly with new items on the weekend and ordering from Amazon constantly, getting a new thing because I put all this work into this. I better be getting a good payout for it. When the actual reward is the better reward is what you do with your time and the relationships that you establish and the positive impact that you have on the world. That's what Vervaeke is getting at. And I think that that whole paradigm, like the discussion that we're having right now, that's not being discussed at a very high level. It's not being discussed in the universities. And even with the deepest thinkers like Jordan Peterson himself, he doesn't seem to have this nuance. And I'm so like that scares me because people at his level and his knowledge can still fall victim to ideology.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that this ties into the next topic. So we are talking about the determinism of morality and being a good person. We were talking about Sapolsky and how he talked about the judges, where if you're hungry, you become more harsh in your moral judgments as a judge. So I think that health is actually one of these causal factors. Like if you're healthy, then your body is working properly, your algorithms are working properly, and you can be more moral. You can focus on the future. You can take other perspectives. You can afford to calculate more empathy. Like these are costly things. To be moral is costly. And if you're like barely surviving because you've got diseases and you're fatigued and mental health problems, you have less resources to dedicate to being a good person in the first place. And so just like you're saying, there's a constellation of diet, hygiene, sleep, exercise, trying to become healthy. It's part of cultivating yourself as a better agent, right? We can become more capable in the world through all of these things, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so part of me wonders that on the Jordan Peterson front, he was really unhealthy for a while, and I sometimes ask myself if that affected him, because it seems like he kind of became less nuanced after his health problems.
I had not considered that, and that may be the case, because of course what he'd have to learn in that process of coming out of that, and was it benzos, I think. Yeah, he was having.
I mean, he was like, yeah, his withdrawals were insane, and like I'm not trying to like victim blame. But like if we're trying to see the determinism and the causal chains, like it's important. Like, can we fix these health? Like, let's fix these health problems. Maybe we can get better results. You know what I mean?
Right, and so that can start to sound like we need to fix society instead of the self. And so that immediately gets you thrown back into the left or whatever, or blaming society for the problems. And
back to Luigi. Cycled all the way back to Luigi.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I get thrown into when I talk about this on social media, and that's why I'm taking this conversation to YouTube and to these places in Discord where I can have more nuanced discussion, because I am immediately thrown into that camp of it's just resilience, it's just pulling your bootstraps when I go to think about this. And I mean, it makes sense, like from what Peterson came out of, like the main paradigm that you're operating under is the confidence and resilience and determination. Like you're determined to improve yourself. You're in this it's the growth mindset, and it's emotional resilience, not just emotional awareness, but emotional resilience. And it seems like he's I mean, now I feel bad. Of course, I always feel bad when I talk about this, but like, yeah, from that perspective, I mean, if that's what brought him out of that, of course he's going to be preaching that, or of course he's going to be making that the main crux of his argument is confidence and resilience and regulating your own emotions and becoming emotionally aware and controlling everything top down. And I talk about this so much because that's Like what I just described is CBT in a nutshell, and that's what people are calling CBT medical gaslighting, because it's, I mean, the only person to blame is yourself in that case. You can no longer blame your environment or your society if you take it that way. But what CBT is actually meant to be encouraging is giving you as many controls as you can, is giving you a dashboard of controls and frameworks to operate from, to indeed control your environment so that you don't have to constantly be regulating yourself. There's no victim blaming involved in that, or there's no victimization, there's no self-degradation or beating yourself up under that. That's the assumption that's involved in this when you first start picking up CBT. But the idea of that is to give you this mindfulness training. I mean, CBT it's just mindfulness from the East condensed into a Western framework. That's kind of that in a nutshell. I'm sure Aaron Beck and Greg Enriquez would disagree to some extent, but that's...
How do you feel about CBT for gut pain or back pain?
So when it comes to physical pain, that's very complex. There are doctors that I've researched and listened to. So there's one, he's a back pain and neck pain specialist, or just pain specialist in general, and he says that the majority of patients he sees are for neck and back pain. And he says that 80% of those cases are non-structural. There's no structural damage. It's just stress-based. So that is you physically psychosomatizing your stresses into the place that's most commonly culturally influenced. In the United States in particular, we have more back pain, neck pain. In other regions of the world, it's arthritis, or it's hot feelings in the chest. That's one that's more common in China, I believe. The fact that this is so culturally bound is also just incredible. Like, it shows you how influenced we are by cultural narrative and the way that we speak. For instance, we use the term, "that's a real pain in the neck."
Yeah.
Right? And so you hear that enough times as a child, you think, like, once you get stressed, some part of, like, this is so magical, like, this is so crazy that it works like this, but some part of your unconscious brain, like, puts that stress into your neck because it's heard this repetition of the phrase, "that's a pain in the neck." It somewhat seems to work like that at some level.
So you're saying he thinks that a lot of these pains are just it's kind of our body brainwashes itself into pain in the first place.
Yeah.
And so we need CBT to brainwash our body out of the pain that it brainwashed itself into.
Right. I was trying to avoid saying that CBT will directly help that, but I mean, that's as much mindfulness as you can achieve to take more control over your situation, to eat healthier, to monitor your diet, or monitor your sleep and your diet and your friends and your exercise.
Yeah.
And I mean, that as much as you can do that, the better chances you'll have, I guess, of mitigating those factors.
To me, CBT makes sense for like psychological problems and psychological pains. It makes less sense for physical, like gut, back, neck. And to me, it's like wild to think that we can just think our way out of physiological pain. It's like,
that's exactly...
Imagine it's not there. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Absolutely. That's what a lot of people will say on social media now, and a lot of the feedback that I hear from others as well in real life. It's just like, I mean, I just had a conversation about this recently with someone, and they were under the CBT as medical gaslighting effect. And when I used that phrase to her, she lit up and said, "Yes, that's exactly it." She proceeded to describe this as just smiling your way through it. Like, life is not some fantasy world that you can just put on rose-colored glasses and just go smell the roses and everything will be fine. Like, that's not CBT. But CBT and mindfulness practices in general will involve these gratitude exercises, these deep connection, this feeling of establishing this connection and interdependence with the world that may indeed involve smelling the roses, or actually appreciating and being present in the experiences that you're having, as opposed to just being beholden to them or just rushing through them. We do a lot of rushing around here in the West, and that psychosomatizes as well. So yeah, you're never gonna just like smile your way through it. There is old psychology that said if you literally force yourself to smile more, like that also psychosomatizes positively. And there's been a lot of studies on that. That seems kind of fraught. I certainly would not recommend that, but that's and like the standing up straight. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard people talking about that. Like when you walk and stand up straight, it psychosomatizes positively, and reciprocally enforces this positive confidence in yourself.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so that I do practice that, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't depend on that, I guess, is the way to think about it. Like, I don't think this is going to fix me. I just want to fix my posture and and try to be more confident. Also, I'm kind of
Yeah.
short too, so that doesn't that's not bad practice in general.
It's-
But,
yeah. Right. Get a centimeter or two.
yeah. So that's how I think about that. So the term that I've heard some people use is a forward center of mass approach to life.
A forward what?
A forward center of mass.
Oh wow. Huh.
Lex
Like
Friedman uses that phrase, actually. Of all people.
I mean, gravitationally, the center of mass is kind of where the gravity is pulling. So when you say forward center of mass, you mean something in front of you is pulling you forward?
Right, and this brings me back to the concept of Sopherson, or being gravitated towards the good and gravitated towards the right actions, and not feeling so much resistance towards that. So that, to me, I try to distinguish between the bootstrap pulling and just unrelenting confidence and constant emotional resilience, or just suppressing
Kind
your
of like
emotions.
beating
and all that.
yourself into
Yeah.
submission, kind of a thing,
Right.
right?
That's also a big perception of what CBT, people think of CBT when they first hear it, is this,
Yeah.
you're just suppressing the emotions and just ignore everything, because it is top-down monitoring. It is cognitive behavioral therapy. You're using your cognition to change your behavior. And that kind of can ignore the other processes of social psychology, of emotion-focused psychologies like EFT and ACT and RABT, and other processes like that. So it's a holistic process. Again, you do the training there to help the other therapies work better. It helps you catch yourself before you wreck yourself, essentially, and it helps you recognize when you're not in that forward center of mass, and you don't beat yourself up for it. You gently form a compassionate relationship with your emotions, with your resistances. The primary example I go to with this, and I forged this fortunately many years ago, I jump out of bed every morning. I physically jump out of the bed.
Yeah. Wow.
That's the forward momentum. I mean, I don't completely. I'll like roll forward really quick and just get on my feet. And it's like, all right, now it's time to do this thing. And yeah, I want to say that's different than just bootstrap pulling. Like, I want to say that's a different narrative. That's a readiness for the challenge and a readiness to take on new challenges and being in a mode of learning as well. A lot of times learning can be quite uncomfortable if you're not in a forward center of mass attitude. If you're not in this forward-leaning confidence.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. Like learning, goal-oriented learning is, from my experience and perspective, it's so much more effective. Like for example, when you're in school, like, did you learn Spanish like most Americans in school? Growing up, like K through 12, Spanish classes left and right. Nobody ever learned it well because it was like, why? Nobody understood the why. But it's like once you have like a really good why, like why am I learning this? Suddenly you actually care and you actually learn it. You know what I mean?
Right. So this point you make in our notes here, kids who are told you are smart struggle long term more than kids who are told you have potential, or you worked hard on that. Good job.
Right. That's the but like you are smart, that's a fixed mindset. It's like you equals smart, you're fixed at smart. Right. And then they feel like anxious, or it's like, oh, if I perform badly, then I'll be fixed at dumb. And I don't want to be fixed at dumb. So I'm like constantly anxious to like be a perfectionist and be fixed at smart. But then when you just tell people like you got a good score because you worked so hard, and if you keep working hard, you can get even better scores. That gives them like this growth paradigm. It's like if I put X effort, I get Y results. And so now they've got that, like you said, the forward center of mass. It's like more effort, more reward that guides them forward.
Right. And another point about the forward center of mass is that it takes practice. Like your brain becomes adapted to that, kind of like when you're running or when you're exercising. It sucks at first, and it sucks for the first few days or even weeks that you get into that, but eventually you get used to it and you start to actually really enjoy it. And instilling that is so important, and it's also so variable, because it might work within a few weeks or a few days for some people, but it might take months for another person. And so this again goes back to the idea of like you just got to keep trying and just stay in that confidence mode, but also not beat yourself up from the grind culture perspective.
I kind of want to address something at this point. Lots of theists. I interact with theists a lot, and like philosophically, and the theists often will say something to the effect of, "Well, in an atheistic, materialistic paradigm of no free will, like there's no meaning, there's no forward center of gravity to guide you forward, and so everything is just meaningless suffering, and we should end it all." Like that's the theist critique of the atheist worldview. What do you, based on everything we've discussed, how would you address that critique?
That does seem like the reaction. What it sounds like to me is that they're operating from that as their major paradigm. Again, going back to the idea, they have a holy book that gives them thousands of words that's structuring their language. There's a quote, my words paint my reality, or the limit of my words determines the limit of my reality. And when you have that vast, deep, and mythical narrative structure there, that's also deeply tied to mysticism and the powerful notions in that regard, anything that sounds counter to that sounds like laziness, it sounds like selfishness, it sounds like sin, it sounds like evil. Those words don't make as much sense to the determinist, or to people that are considering deeply the values of determinism, I should say. Sin, I mean, what is sin exactly? There are translations that call that missing the mark. I kind of like that. What is evil? I don't see things as evil anymore since learning this way. That word I've eliminated from my vocabulary, honestly. I'm using it now to simplify this, and this is another point I wanted to make in future videos, but maybe we'll get to this here for a bit. Hatred and evil, those two words I now no longer use at all.
Hate, you said hate and evil?
Right. Those two words I've found, since learning about how determinism works, or just learning to think about that, I find absolutely no value in considering those concepts as existent. And this is also an existentialist perspective. You can choose your existence. You can choose the essence of your existence and all that. And I don't see any value in seeing anything as evil in the world. And I've witnessed a lot of atrocities. I've witnessed some horrible things that humans have done to me and to my friends. And that it still does nothing for me to view that as evil. It's just misguidedness. People are highly misguided. They're operating from really unhelpful paradigms and belief systems, and so I can't possibly hate them for that. Like there's no room for me to have any feeling of hate. It's just love. It's just love and different forms of love. Reality is what it is. This is also an Eastern concept. Man, it's very powerful. And to the Westerner, this doesn't, or to the, especially the religious Westerner, that doesn't rest easily on the Western ear. That's like, what do you mean you're not hating anything? Like, don't you hate those people? Don't you hate, this outgroup in particular, whatever? And of course not. Absolutely not. I want to fix them. I want to help them fix themselves, I should say, because I love them, because I love everything about existing that I can possibly love. Now, I mean, I'm telling myself this, and of course there are levels of love, but this way of living was influenced by the concept of privatio boni. So privatio boni means, this is the conception of God put forth by some of the early philosopher Christians, who they described everything under God's creation as good, and that which we think of as evil as simply the privation of good. It's privatio boni. So everything is good, and everything that we don't like is just less good. Why even bother employing the word evil? We want to employ that word evil because we have this desire towards tit for tat balancing. This like all the world must be perfectly even, and we have to have a concept of God as the good and Satan as the source of all evil. And so when you're tempted by sin, you're tempted by this entity called Satan, who is the source of all that is bad. And indeed, there are things that are not good, but also employing the word bad, that's not really helping me either. That doesn't benefit my mental health in a way, and that isn't the kind of life that I want to live. And that also starts to sound like rose-colored glasses. That sounds like you're just living in a fantasy world where you're just creating your own little fantasy that you're living by. And that's my point, is that we all have to create our reality. We all have to operate under some framework, lest we become beholden to someone else's. And so far, I haven't found a lot of good ones. Like, I haven't found a better way of thinking than that yet.
Yeah. That was a powerful answer. And like, there's a certain level of moral beauty to that answer. Like, when I hear you talk about that perspective, I'm like, wow. Like, part of me is like, that's such a beautiful mentality. It draws me towards it. It's like, in a way, I'm being persuaded. I want to think this way because it's so beautiful. I have a slightly different perspective. I'm kind of interested in going through it to see what you think. And I think I can be very persuadable because I see the beauty of what you're offering. But rewind back to the meaning question. Theist says, you atheists, you're all postmodern people with no meaning, no purpose, no truth, and nihilism, and materialism, and no free will, and no, just, right, bad, right? So, from the way I frame my response to this question is usually in terms of sentience. Sentience is often a misused word. In philosophy, sentience is the ability to feel. So the ability to feel, that encompasses any type of feeling, right? So, like, I often, in thinking moralistically, in thinking from a well-being perspective, the fundamental ingredients of sentience are pleasure and pain, right? And animals probably all have this type of sentience. Agents probably, bacteria, they have approach mechanisms and retreat mechanisms, and that is analogous to pleasure, pain. Pleasure means go approach it, pain means go away from it. So, like, maybe pleasure and pain goes all the way down to bacteria. Maybe. It's hard to prove. Consciousness, hard problem of consciousness. We don't exactly know how to prove or test these things. But, like, as a brute fact, right? As a brute fact, we can introspect. We can look within ourselves. Pain and pleasure, it exists within ourselves. That's real, right? That's powerful stuff. Like, we're operating within a landscape of powerful feelings. And, it's hypocritical for us to be solipsistic. Like, we look out, we see all these other humans. They are structured just like we are. They have blood, they have flesh, they have nerves, they have bones. They're built like us. It would be illogical to say we're the only ones with feelings. They don't have feelings. So at a minimum, we have to grant that all humans have feelings, right? So once you grant that every human has feelings, that means you live within a landscape of meaning. Everywhere you look is meaning. That human, he has positive or negative meaning. If I say something nice to him, he has more positive meaning. If I say something mean, he has more negative meaning. So every action I take impacts all of the meaning around me. I can increase other people's well-being or decrease it. I can increase my own, decrease it. So, like, just the fact that sentience exists, it means that there's meaning everywhere. So this theist concept that, oh, there's no meaning to life in your worldview. Like, what are you talking about? Everywhere I look is meaning. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And yeah, that meaning is what you make of it. Simply put, if you see something that is a horrible atrocity, you can contemplate that, you can process that. That's what separates us from the majority of other organisms, it seems. So the bacteria may be operating under the process of pleasure-pain dichotomies. Many of the other, I'd say the large majority of mammals and all other animals are operating under that. We have the privilege of being able to make meaning out of what we're witnessing. So when I see some horrible atrocity, I process that as fast as possible as a state of misguidedness, or something that is, it is what it is. This is a practice in radical acceptance, but you don't stop at that and just let it be. The meaning in that also extends to, this is not a good meaning. This is something that could have a better meaning to it. It says consequences, and so it is meaningful to me to take action to prevent that, or to process it in a way that's more beneficial towards me and my fellow man. An example I'll use is when my dog was run over last year. I felt horrible about that, and I cried deeply for days, and that left me with a feeling of holding no animosity towards the person who did it, though. After starting to think this way, after leaving my Christian faith, after abandoning the word evil, after abandoning the word hatred, and removing those concepts from my vocabulary as much as I can, I realized that it's working. This is actually working. I don't want to go hunt down the person who's living somewhere in my neighborhood with a super giant truck, a loud truck or whatever, and hunt them down and do something about this. I also have somebody who ratted me out that I'm pretty sure I know who did that, who could have sent me to prison for 10 years. Fortunately, I got 14 months in a rehab center in Alabama. And I had other friends that were trying to hunt him down. They showed me websites where I could look up people that have been they've been taken into custody or whatever, where they asked them, is there anyone that you want to rat out, essentially, to get a lighter sentence? And I'm pretty sure we know who it was, but I have no desire whatsoever to go after that person. And that now that was before I started learning this way, so I may just have a genuine default towards thinking that way too. But so this was a few years after I left the Christian faith. I wasn't thinking philosophically at that time and questioning the words evil and hatred, but I did find myself thinking, I see no benefit in hunting them down. Now that I process this more, now that I think deeper on it, I'm drawn towards thinking I want the best for them and I want them to get the help they need. The same is true for the person who ran over my dog. I noticed that I'm not using the word killed my dog. I'm not using the word murdered my dog. They weren't conscious of that. They were being irresponsible, and it was also probably an accident to some degree. And so yeah, it's like that. It's that concept. The same thing with people who do horrible things to you. And we talked about this before. Like the steel man for this is, I will smile as you beat me. I will look up with you and just think, yep, you're pretty misguided. Ouch, that hurt. But man, I hope you get what you need to help this, bro. I want to live by that. And of course, this is not perfect. No philosophy is, no life philosophy is, but I want to see that, and I'd like to see more religions exemplify that as well. I believe that the Eastern religions, coming from the standpoint, like the overarching axiom of it is what it is, and then you can choose what you do about it. That seems very different than what we see in the Western paradigm, the Western religions. So I guess that's how I feel about that.
Yeah, that's beautiful in a lot of ways. I kind of want to address that before I address the other thing. So there's this concept of like neighborhoods with pollution. What is it called? Graffiti. Neighborhoods with graffiti suffer more crime. Neighborhoods that clean up the environment suffer less crime. And when you're thinking about causation, you have to be careful about the directionality right? Is it this area has less criminals, therefore there's no graffiti? Or is it the lack of graffiti
Right.
reduces criminal behavior? Like, which is the cause, which is the effect, right? I think, I'm not exactly sure about this. I heard someone talking about it to the effect of they think that the chain of causation goes from environment to criminality. So if you clean up the neighborhood, it will reduce future crime. Um, that's fascinating. And trying to tie that back to what you were saying, just like just as like the aesthetic of an environment like is similar to the behavioral aesthetic. So for example, what am I trying to say? If you're let's say someone runs over your dog or someone hurts you. Now they observe you being forgiving. What does that do for them? So your forgiveness is kind of like this bright light to the person saying, you live within a forgiving society. Well, then they're going to be like, well, damn, like I thought I lived in a tit for tat society, so we got to be harsh to each other. And like, well, I'm seeing a forgiving person. I need to level up my game to match this society. Does does that make sense?
Right. And then
Like,
the other reaction is this is a person I can take advantage of because they're too weak. And this is politics. This is when you see a weak nation with no army. That means we can take them over easily. That's the weak point of my
right,
argument here.
exactly. So yeah, there's two sides of it. There's there's the potential game theoretic victimization side, and then there's the like you're setting a higher standard that people can grow into. You know what I mean? And so like if lots of people in the environment are being forgiving, that might elevate people's behavior. They're like, well, damn, I like this society. I don't want to get kicked out of this society. Like everyone's forgiving. I need to be a better person to match all of these good examples around me. You know what I mean?
Right. So I guess I should clarify. I'm not necessarily talking about forgiveness, though. This would be so you forgive in your heart, but not in the hand. I think that's kind of an outdated phrasing, but the the attitude there is unconditional positive regard. So
Okay.
the people that commit horrible atrocities
Yeah.
and people that run over dogs could probably use some lessons in better driving, or the people that try to rat me out could use some
Are you
better
trying?
teaching in
Are you
that
trying
regard.
to say that? Are you trying to say that forgiveness implies that they had responsibility in the first place, and you are rejecting their responsibility in the first place, and so forgiveness isn't even needed?
The way that I think about forgiveness is kind of like how I said, where it's forgiving in your heart, but in reality, things have consequences. Actions have consequences, and people need to fix the fact that they are misguided. And so I want to help them get the help that they need to become better versions of themselves, so that they don't continue to do these not good things.
Yeah. So they don't need forgiveness because you're just accepting the way they are.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ways that we think about forgiveness is that we're just putting it out of our minds. Like, all right, I forgive you. Um, don't do it again, but I forgive you for doing this. And I mean, that's basically what I'm saying too. It's just an ongoing state of forgiveness with consequences too. Like, I'm not just going to let people walk over me. And that's what a lot of responses that I get when I talk about this seem to be, is that, well, you're just going to be a doormat for people in that regard. And
Yeah.
this is where I start to think along these lines, where I would rather be a doormat and make more people happy than be overconfident and be a jerk. And so I try to deeply weigh those options. I'd rather be poor and kind than rich and selfish. That lines up with that way of thinking too, I believe. I want to do more for people and put myself at risk more, and deprive myself of luxuries and amenities to provide those luxuries and amenities for others. But it's not that I'm looking for that. Like, I'm not going out of my way to be taken advantage of. Like, there's a balance with all of this, I think. I mean, gravitating towards the unconditional positive regard is kind of what I mean with that.
Yeah, yeah. That's kind of the deterministic perspective, right? Forgiveness is kind of the Christian model. So I think I generally agree that a more deterministic style of forgiveness is the positive regard, I guess.
Absolutely. That's where I derive that from. Is reality is heavily determined. Most people are operating in autopilot mode, even when they get caught up and try to like plot out horrible actions like what we saw with what Luigi did. If he had had more time, if he had had better friends, if he had had better exposures, he probably would have made better decisions. It seems like he got caught up in his emotions. He found one action that would bring him a lot of fame, and it would solve a lot of problems, he thought, and so he went with that. But if he had been less deterministic about that, or if he had been more deliberate, then he probably would have seen better regard, or better actions.
Okay. Okay. So now I think we can go back to this paradigm of evil. So tell me what you think about. So as we've talked about, I look at a lot of morality through the lens of game theory, and game theory often invokes things like tit for tat. And you could, like, I've seen that you argue against tit for tat a lot. And I think it's very valid to challenge this tit for tat mentality, which, just to be clear, tit for tat is, if you're good to me, I will be good to you. If you're bad to me, I will be bad to you. Right? So it's kind of a revenge mentality. It's a very reciprocal. It's very
I call
transactional.
I call it the vengeance mindset. Yeah.
Right. So you can critique this, but like, if you're gonna, like, I think that to be an agent of the world, you have to have a strategy that you act out. So the like, are you gonna be the tit for tat strategy, or are you gonna transcend tit for tat for a better strategy, right? Then you can argue about which strategy is better, and you can believe what, based on, everyone calculates what they think is best. So you could, it seems like you're advocating a strategy of this unconditional positive regard. Somehow, though, you mentioned you don't let people walk over you. So it sounds like there's a little bit of tit for tat smuggled in somewhere. Is that correct?
I think this is where it's useful to question the logic here, or the formulation aspect of this. I know a lot of what we talk about, and especially in ethics, has to adhere to logical formalisms, because we're naturally talking in the abstract and we're trying to find a logical formalism to operate under.
Yeah.
I think this is more where it's subjective, and it's based on personal experience and the environment that you're living in. So I have a friend who was my closest friend for many, many years, and he fell into a habit of operating under tit for tat.
Uh-huh.
And he became verbally abusive. He became just unbearable. It was unbearable to deal with him, because he was operating under this, and this isn't so much vengeance. He was actually quite a kind, positive person in public. But when it came to our personal relationship, for example, he would try to, like, he would give me like $5 worth of weed about like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I would say, well, I'll give you a ride to work or whatever, and he'd say, well, I gave you that weed, so I guess we're good on gas money or whatever. Like, it was just, everything was calculated perfectly. Everything had to be perfectly tit for tat even, and that can destroy relationships. There's a quote, when it comes to marriage, each party is not 50-50, it's 100-100.
Yeah.
That's also quite vague, though. That's also a logical formalism, and you kind of have to flesh that out for yourself in your own marriage, in your own personal relationship.
Yeah, that's tricky. They're gonna be like that. That sounds like it has the potential to be overbearing. It's like you're supposed to give me 100%, and why are you not giving me 100%? It's like,
Exactly.
okay,
So you can
calm,
also
calm
take
down,
that.
dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah.
But that
So
doesn't exactly answer your question, though. Like that, I don't want that to be a cop
right,
out answer either.
right. How do you incorporate a mechanism to not get taken advantage of under this kind of idealistic moral mode of being?
I mean, maybe this is where the agency first attitude, the I'm going to select which friends I hang around the most so that I don't get taken advantage of as most comes in, or as much.
Okay. So like kind
You know
of
what I mean?
controlling your environment kind of a thing.
Yeah, and that's not intervening on anyone. That's not going to hurt anyone's feeling. I mean, you may have to lose some friends, but also I don't believe in that either. If I want to use the word believe there, I think I try to stay in touch with everyone. I don't cut people out of my lives. I think that's also a very kind of vengeancey way of living, or just a self-serving attitude. And when you look at social media as well, there are lots of memes going around exemplifying this idea. Like there's one I saw where it was just like scissors emojis, and it said snip snip snip, watch how fast I cut you out of my life. And I was like, wow, good for you. Like you're really showing self-ownership, and you know your boundaries. Like it's all about setting boundaries now, and that's very good. You should definitely set boundaries, but also don't be so eager to cut people out of your lives. Like that doesn't seem like a connected way to live. That seems like a very Western, individualistic, isolated way of living that's only self-serving and only is concerned about your current emotional state and your lived experience, preserving that. So I check in with people and I'll visit them as well, but I do so with my own boundaries of interaction. Like I'm not going to go back to the same deep relationships that I had with them at one time. It's again, I come back to nuance. Like this is always nuanced. We can't really find a perfect formalism for this way of thinking because it's so subjective and particular in nature. It's your lived experience, the reality that you live in. If I was in another country or an impoverished nation where I was in much more risk of being taken advantage of, then I would be thinking differently about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd still
That's
be operating
interesting.
from, like, my emphasis is more so on the meta contemplative aspect of this when I go back home to think about it, and also when I am living in the moment. I want to be living from this positive regard attitude where people are mostly just misguided, operating on autopilot. And so I'll try to hone that as a reaction as well. Like when somebody wrongs me, I want to have the reaction of, "Hey man, I understand that you're in a bad place right now. Here's what worked for me, or here's a therapist that I like that I think will do well for you." I want that to be my instant reaction. Now, of course, there's also deep deterministic neurochemistry underlying this as well, and this also contradicts CBT in some ways, where you still have the limbic response, like the limbic reflex of defense mode and the sympathetic nervous system response. But training that parasympathetic response, that's where CBT helps. That's where the mindfulness practices and the diet, sleep, and exercise and relationships and meaning structures kick in. Because if your meaning structure is also one of everything that looks bad to me or looks like evil is evil, and it's not the privation of good, then that's what that means to me. And fortunately, as humans, we can change the meaning.
Say that again. What does evil mean to you?
If that's always the if bad actions or non-good actions are always evil, then that's the meaning for me. But for me, I want to have the meaning as the privation of good. I want it to be that privatio boni way of looking at things.
Okay. All right. So this is perfect. So
But it sounds like playing
when it,
games with words. Sorry to interrupt. But I'm also very wary of that. Like it sounds like semantics. And I'm saying like that's kind of the point, is that we use language to change the meaning structure. We use language to change how we operate and how we react to things and how we reflect once we get back home too. Like I'm not going to go back home and plot against this person that did something bad to me, because now I'm operating under privatio boni, basically.
okay. Oh man. So paradigm of evil. I think that when I think about evil, like I have a new perspective. So I used to be Mormon, Latter-day Saint. I had that kind of theistic perspective. Then I had to process like what does evil even mean? Now I have a new perspective. So a little bit different. You said okay, but back to something else you said. Good, but evil is the. Did you say evil is the privation of good? Is that how you phrased it?
I
Is the lack
try
of
not to think in terms of
or
evil at all.
yeah?
When I see bad, like it's when I see something that is not good, it's considered bad. To me,
uh,
the word evil has religious connotations automatically.
right?
Evil is so heavily laden with that. It doesn't serve me to adopt that word. And again, I could go to any other language in the world. I'd probably see something like that. But when I look at where it probably came from the mystical aspect of evil as some kind of satanic essence
Yeah.
that exists in the world. And that just doesn't serve me. Like from a determinist perspective, everything literally is just what it is. We're evolving along this path, and there sure is a lot of horrible atrocities and very not good things, very, very bad aspects of the world. But it doesn't, like, I can choose what words I attribute to that. And to me, it serves no purpose for me. Evil serves nothing. It's just the privation of good and how much of that is being privated
Okay.
or is being taken away from the goodness of the world that I'd like to see.
So tell me if I got this right. From your paradigm, instead of thinking in terms of good and evil, you think in terms of good and the lack of good.
Right.
Is that's your thinking
Privation of
style?
good, yeah.
Okay. So theists sometimes think in a similar way. I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Theists often, but theists
That's where
often they often attribute what you're calling the lack of good. They call that evil. um, I usually take issue with that theistic stance, and so I want to hear what you think about this.
It's Saint
So
Augustine. Sorry, this is Saint Augustine from the
yeah,
4th century. Yeah.
yeah. So my issue is that I don't. So like I talked about sentience, and I said pleasure and pain, right? So I view things. I'm very influenced by Sam Harris's moral landscape, and so like when I think about like reality, I don't think just about like pleasure and lack of pleasure. Like that's to me that's missing a huge aspect of reality, which is pain, right? So to me, this negative side of reality is highly relevant. I think you suffer chronic pain. I suffer chronic pain. Like that's a
We
big
suffer
part of our
different for
lives.
this is. I'm glad you brought that up too, man, because I didn't want
Yeah.
to. I didn't want to intrude on your experience or talk about this without you saying anything. But I mean, yeah, you have back pain, and that
Mhm.
is chronic in the way that you always deal with that in one way or another. I have Crohn's disease,
Yeah.
which is a chronic
Uh-huh.
disease, but I'm not always having stomach aches.
Uh-huh.
But
Okay.
when I am out of remission, I try to think in this way, and I find that it does benefit my experience.
Mm.
And also, I realize that, and this is probably different from your situation because your back pain is probably structural in nature. The the taking account for the diet, the sleep, and the exercise, especially exercise, that one has that results in me not having Crohn's flare-ups at all. Like when I'm working and on my
Wow.
feet,
Wow.
I just uploaded a video on this too, and I try to describe this in detail. When I'm working
Mm.
warehouse jobs, I don't have any symptoms. I have nothing.
Wow. That's amazing.
But also practicing the mindfulness and practicing deep interoception, becoming receptive to my body's signals, I can now detect Crohn's disease flare-ups many days in ahead. It's usually like 4 days in advance. Like something's wrong.
Wow.
I can feel an ulcer starting to form because I have neurons in my gut. But we don't teach people to think that way in the U.S. Just a bit of a tangent there, you know. Like if people were taught how to be detecting that instead of just gravitating straight towards I'm going to take medication to fix my problems for me,
Right.
then
Right.
we may not have so much. And the stress is also that ups those glucocorticoids, just like Sapolsky talked about in why zebras get ulcers.
Yeah.
Zebras or don't get ulcers because zebras don't have this reciprocal looping process of stress that humans do. And so if you can
Yeah.
mindfully take account for that and create a good meaning structure, create a good mindfulness practice where you're not just like avoiding thinking about the stress or avoiding thinking about the fact that I have this disease. No, this is so deep and integral to the human condition and the human lived experience. That's incredibly important to me in that way.
Just an aside, do you take lots of NSAID painkillers? Is that a contributing factor or no?
So I try to avoid painkillers as much as possible. It's hard to get access to them as well with Crohn's disease. Doctors are very reluctant since the painkiller epidemics that we've seen over the past couple decades. It's much harder to get them, but I have been prescribed them in the hospital when I'm having flare-ups. I've had Dilaudid, and I've had fentanyl, like extremely high doses of painkillers, because the pain is incredible. It's all encompassing. Like you can't do anything but think about it to a degree. I mean, that's not the right way to say that. I should clear that up. It is all encompassing is not the right word, because you can do these mindfulness practices, and that to me is, it's not so much like you're just being mindful. In this way, you are kind of employing the rose-colored glasses of this, and I try to be very careful with this term. I have a lot of writing on this as well. The rose-colored glasses metaphor, it's just changing another framework. Like, it's changing the way that you think about this. I'm being present in this moment. For example, I'm feeling the pain. I realize this is going to pass. That part of that is so important. Like, realizing that this is not just going to take me over, and that I can kind of put my mind in another place. That's so important. So the strong example for this is Thich Gong Duk, I think. Yeah, the man who he committed self-immolation.
Oh.
You may have seen this on the cover of the Rage Against the Machines album. So Thich Gong Duk, he was a practicing Buddhist monk, and he exemplified the power of the mind over the body in the ultimate depiction of this. He lit himself on fire, and he sat there in strong, deep meditation with no reaction whatsoever until his lungs could no longer breathe, because his lungs became inflamed and he just fell over. And that took a few good minutes too. Wow. So like that, I mean, that is so powerful. I get like choked up when I think about this and start talking about it. Like, man, I mean, just like, what are we doing in the US? What are we doing in the West right now? If you have that kind of power, you know what I mean? If you have that kind of control, if you can establish that, I mean, there's so much misunderstanding when it comes to psychosomatism and psychosomatization.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so you start talking like that, and it starts to sound like bootstrap pulling as well. It's like, just think through it, and you can just deal with that and be on fire, and you'll be fine. It's like obviously not that simple either.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that kind of that level of like self-discipline and top-down control, but I'm also a little bit wary of it, because I come from a background, like I come from a religious background that was very self-disciplined, and I feel like it can go too far in like a harmful direction. You know, it's like, I'm just gonna not eat food, and now my body is, broken. I'm just gonna not sleep, and now my body is broken. You know what I mean? Like, I have a lot of health problems that are probably because I exerted too much self-control during formative years, at the sacrifice of my health. You know what I mean? So you have to be careful with going too far. Probably most people don't have that problem, but some people do. Okay, so back to this paradigm of evil. So, like, for me, when I think about good and evil, I'm thinking about it on this well-being spectrum of pain and pleasure, right? So, like, pain would be an ontological evil. Pleasure would be an ontological good. What do I mean by ontological? It's almost like it's a substance that exists. Pleasure, in and of itself, is a good substance. And pain, in and of itself, is a bad substance. It's just like tautological. We you know what I mean? Like, all things being equal. Like, people like to be like, well, drugs are so pleasurable. Drugs are good, right? Nah. Okay, shut up. Just get rid of all the other variables. Pleasure in and of itself is good. And then pain in and of itself is bad. That's basically the definition. Like, good to approach, bad should avoid. That's like how
Right.
biology works, right?
So, okay, this is actually Andrew Huberman has fallen for this as well, and he's had people on his podcast that have described this in this perspective, where the majority of the brain's reactions are can be reduced to either yuck or yum.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen interviews that he's hosted where people challenge that perspective, and he's still kind of stuck to it. So not to critique him, he may be, I haven't listened to him in a few years now, and he may have changed his ways of thinking on that. But
Sure.
that when it comes to reducing the concepts of good and like thinking in terms of good and evil, to me, that's way too simple. In every single case, that's always way too simple, I guess is what I mean. Same thing with pleasure and pain. And also, I'm very wary of equating those. So equating pain to evil or pain to bad is also not necessarily good, because, I mean, think about it. When you have certain pain, it is good for you. Like, no pain, no gain. That's why we have that term in exercise. So there are types of pain that are like that. When it comes to chronic pain, though, that is quite annoying, and it can be considered evil. But again, I gotta ask, does that benefit you to consider that as a pervading evil that must remain with you in your life? Or is that the whole it is what it is, radical acceptance part of it? Or can that be viewed through a better paradigm? You know, I guess the message I want to get across here is that just always considering the better paradigm and just questioning, how can I look at this better? And to me, in every single instance I've seen since thinking this way, when I go to think in terms of evil and thinking in terms of hatred, it never behooves me. It never serves me. So thinking with nuance and prioritizing this whole nuance and humility aspect of creating these structural frameworks for living, that to me that's when it's most necessary, is when it comes to reducing your experiences into a dichotomy of some sort. And this is like, I see why people are, I'm not saying you're doing this, I see this with everyone, the reducing certain experiences into a dichotomy. When I hear dichotomies, I start getting red flags. That's because I've trained myself to think that way, to think in terms of nuance first and humility first, and that serves me extremely well. The exceptions, there are also obviously exceptions to this. Like, you can't just always be nuanced, or indeed you'll be a doormat and get walked on. So
yeah. Okay, so like, I think I have a lot of nuance. I think I could discuss this for a long time if we want to. So it depends. How long have we been going so far?
It's been a couple hours here, 2.5 hours.
Like, this might be a topic worth just going deep on in and of itself. So I guess I'll leave it up to you if you want to go any deeper on this topic.
We're on a roll, and I think we should probably do another half an hour of this and probably close it out, and we'll finish this series over the next episode or two.
Okay.
Morals and such.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. So when you asked about like the utility of the word evil, like, do you grant that the word bad has utility, or not even bad?
Right. So I do use the word not good a lot, but that immediately starts to sound like semantics and playing games with words.
I mean, I view not good as like something like 0, and I view bad as something like -1. So I see a distinction in my paradigm. So for me, if I was to like invent the perfect language, one of the things I would want to do is to include magnitude within adjectives. So like, if we're thinking about like big, large, giant, humongous, like, there's kind of a gradient of magnitude built into the language, right? But our language is not consistent. Like, we have a really horrible philosophy of pain. Like, you go to the doctor and they're like, what's your pain level, 1 to 10? Nobody knows what any of that means.
Right.
Like, we need a gradient of pain. It's like, this is bad, that's -1. This is very bad, that's -2. This is super bad, that's -3. And then like when I think of evil, we're talking about like -9, -10. Like this is like atrocity level behavior. And so the virtue of having magnitudes built into your language is we respond. Like if there is a threat, like this is going to be bad, we need to respond and avoid the bad. And maybe we judge our response based on the magnitude. If it's really bad, we need a bigger response to avoid it. Does that make sense?
Right, but like saying that terrorism is just really bad, that doesn't have as much punch as saying it's evil and that we need to do something about it.
That's my point. So I'm
Yeah.
advocating the utility of the word evil. When we say terrorism is evil, it's like, holy crap, we got to take big actions to avoid this, because it's not like ignorable bad. It's like pay attention bad.
Right. So yeah, I guess I'm glad you're making me think about this like this. So I think this is where it kind of for me comes down to the subjective case by case experience. So when it comes to terrorism or something like that, that's we need to make big political decisions. And so if it's useful to use the word those evil terrorists, that might have utility in that regard. But I also see like the idea that once you start using the term evil, that kind of it speaks to the insular cortex. It speaks to the tribalism, the negative parts of tribalism, where it creates the outgroup. And suddenly all of the Muslims become this word evil.
Yes.
All of the people, all the brown people are the bad people. Yeah.
It goes back to the genocidal language, whereas like you label cockroach, you label them a virus. Labeling them evil is arguably worse.
That's what
Like
I'm saying. Like it's not just language games
yes.
here. Like this is deeply set into the way that we
Right.
conceive in our symbolic representation. This is what Wittgenstein meant by we are bewitched by language. Once you start using the word evil,
Yes.
it triggers these things in the brain. Unless you have this deep conception of how to be nuanced with the way that you interpret the words that you're using, you're going to fall for it. And that's what I'm saying. Like the majority of people do not have that nuance. The majority of people are not taught to question the language that they adopt. This is why I talk about psychology and the diagnostic process so much. It's the exact same mechanism going on there.
Right. So yeah, I think I 1000% agree with the potential danger behind the word. And so definitely that needs to be mitigated. Like the word evil, if we're going to use the word evil, it needs to be used very cautiously, because like in the paradigm I'm building, when I was saying the cockroaches and the viruses and the rodents, like when you say evil, you're almost saying demonic. Like from the religious perspective, a demon is worse than a rodent. Like the rodent is accidentally harmful, the demon is intentionally harmful.
And people aren't demons. Like there's no case ever that a person can be related to a demon. But that's how we used to think when people were having seizures. They thought that they were freaking possessed by a demon, and they had some evil inside them that had to be excavated, and that's just not realistic. Like to me, whenever I hear that word evil used, it's always having that kind of mystical, satanic kind of connotation to it.
Yeah,
and it's so always misguiding. Like that never serves us to use the word, I feel.
And like maybe a really good argument is that the word evil has too much theological baggage, that it needs to be abandoned.
Right.
Like we need it.
That's
if
what
we're
I'm saying, I guess,
if we want linguistic magnitudes, maybe we just need a new word because of all this baggage. So like that seems like a persuasive argument to me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying. But of course you run into problems, because how like creating a new word to fill that gap, or I mean you wouldn't really do, like maybe it's not so much a new word, because that whole concept, that's also kind of what I'm arguing against, is that it serves no one to think in terms of that far into the negative of that. If you're using it on a pain scale, like I don't think it's useful to think in terms of a -10 pain scale, even though you may feel that. Once you start feeling that, that's when in all cases we need to be using some kind of reframing technique.
I'm confused. What was your point on the time on the pain scale?
So if you're using like you're relating evil to kind of the negative 10 aspect of ultimate pain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in every
You're
instance
saying
of
evil
that,
is the wrong word for large pain. Is that what you mean?
right, and also to try to address that feeling of pain as well, like when you're having the subjective experience of ultimate uh, immobilizing pain, which that's like
Yeah.
my Crohn's disease has done that to me, where I can't move and I struggle to speak from the pain. Like I physically can't move my body. I just have to sit and deal with that. The That's when it is always necessary for me to try to bring some kind of different framework into it. Even if I can't will myself to move my body, I still have to do something that's going to be positive about it. Again, that's not rose-colored glasses, or maybe it is. I mean, maybe that's just looking on the bright side or whatever. But I mean, isn't that kind of the idea? Like, shouldn't we be doing that as opposed to withdrawing into the pain or feeling some kind of neutral passivity about it? Now, the neutral passivity, that's the radical acceptance practice, and I think there's also
Yeah.
utility of that. But even that's taking action. When I think of that, I'm not going to be just not doing anything. Like I'll still want to take action, and the same applies to evil, or the concept of ultimate bad or ultimate not good. Like if it behooves
Uh,
me to do nothing about it, I'll do nothing about it. But in the majority of cases, it behooves me and my fellow people to take action in some way. But it's never from a place of preventing evil. It's preventing this retraction from the good. Like we're all trying to work towards making it a better place. This is progressivism, or just progress and improving society.
yeah.
And so it's kind of like privatio society or whatever. It's,
Okay.
the privation of the good society that we're all trying to work for. And like that's the reaction that I want to have instantly to that, instead of seeing it as a bad thing, or as a horrible atrocity, or as evil. I'll just see it as the negative society, or the less good option.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of I think that part of the vibe of the definition of evil is like, it's kind of like saying, if something is evil, what you mean is this thing is so bad that it should not exist. And
Mm,
that's why it's dangerous. That's why it can be genocidal. If you
right,
say a
right.
group is evil, you're basically saying they're so bad they shouldn't exist, right? Like, what do you
Right.
mean? So
Or
that
from the
is
Christian.
kind of
Sorry, go ahead.
mhm. So like in terms of really high levels of pain, like the natural response, at least from my perspective, is this pain should not exist. And so that's why it feels comfortable using evil language.
Right. But in reality, or if you want to call it reality, as evolution is what it is, the pain is going to exist, because that's the primary mode of teaching that natural selection left us with. Now, it doesn't serve us anymore, so I'd like to think that from that perspective, it should not. Uh, it's not that it shouldn't exist because pain is such a useful mechanism, but if I can do something to intervene upon that by taking pain medication, that's not going to compromise my future ability to handle pain, then I would do that. But also, that's case by case basis. Very
Yeah,
specific.
yeah, that's kind of an algorithmic approach to well-being. It sounds like. So so okay, so like it seems like you're kind of, there's kind of in theology there's this distinction between natural evil and um what is the other one called? Like agentic evil. So like
Mm.
natural evil is like pain, hurricanes, all these. There's no intentionality in natural evil. If I have back pain, I'm like, oh, nature is evil. It's not trying to cause me pain. It's just nature, right? So there's no intention. Agentic evil is when agents calculate that harming others is what they want to do. From their perspective, harming others is good. And so that kind of a demonic mindset, right? Harming others is good. Ha ha ha,
Yeah.
right? So like so I guess the question
Well,
is that
that's.
an is
Yeah.
agentic evil, is that an accurate way to use the word evil? And does that exist?
I also think that in all of those cases, those those are cases of misguidedness. Like the agent that's acting there is not being as agential as they could be, or their agency is not aligned with truth and good and beauty.
Uh-huh.
So there's no point in me using the word evil there at all. It's just misguidedness. They need better
That's
guidance.
right. Yeah.
Using that word specifically because like they are not being guided by the right principles. They got taught the wrong values by the wrong people, and they're adhering to those.
Yeah.
And I can blame them for not being as responsible and using their agency to guide themselves better. But again, I kind of default to the using the word forgiveness here in mind because
Yeah.
I realize that they are misguided and they could be guided better.
So you think that it's wrong to say that they're agentically evil? That's inaccurate somehow?
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
inaccurate because
Well, because the demonic aspect, like it's not it never behooves me to think of people as having demons in them or even like relating to anything that is demonic because that word is also old religious style and that serves me nothing. Like that perspective serves nothing for humanity.
so if we redefine evil, so let's say there's religious evil, that's one type of evil. There's natural evil, that's another type of evil. Then there's agentic evil. This is deterministic. It's the agent wants to harm others. That's the definition. There's no magic, no nature, just agency. Under that definition, do you think it's bad to use the word evil because it's connected to the religious thing? Is that your issue? It's loosely connected to that religious paradigm?
Well, it's more, yeah, it's that, and it's also connected to the demonic paradigm. Like, people are not demons, and they're not tapping into some kind of demonic bad thing. Again, this, like, the way I write about this is also, there's no actual good. There's no, everything just is what it is. So you can also say this is absolutely pleasurable, ultimate pleasure, and this person is a godsend, or this person is a saint. Those words are also just as meaningful as you want them to be. So, again, going back to the meaning-making aspect of this, it behooves me nothing to think in terms of evil and really even bad if I want to take it to that extreme. But I can choose this for myself, how much meaning I want to put onto that and what meaning I want to put to it. And in every instance, I found that whenever I see the not good or whenever I see bad or evil or whatever, it always behooves me to change the way I think about that. And now it's like that's been working for me for a few years now, where I actually don't see evil. Like, it's not that I'm ignorant. I know what the bad is. I know that there are terrible things that happen in this world, and I know what pain feels like, and I know that I will never try to inflict pain on others, and I don't want others to inflict pain on other people. But in each case, I've always seen it as misguidedness. Like, if people were just guided under better principles, then they would be doing more good, or at least the better, or whatever, if you don't want to use the term good, pro-society or pro-progressivism, pro-goodness. I'm really thinking about this now too, because like I do want to question more of the goodness too, because like if you're just questioning all language, then you also have to question good and truth and beauty. And so it is more like I was trying to work with the idea of I want to pursue a more true good, and I want to pursue a more good truth, and I want to pursue a more good beauty and a more beautiful good and a more beautiful truth. And all of that is under meaning making. All of that is what you make of the experiences and what you make of other people's actions.
I always have issue with the trichotomy of the good, the beautiful, and the truth, the true. Because I feel like the good subsumes all three. So it's kind of like I kind of prefer revising it, my arrogance to revise Greek philosophy. I like to think of like good as the meta concept, and then good fractures. It fractures into true, the moral, and the beautiful. So,
Did you mean? I don't mean to question you. Did you mean to say fractals?
I said fracture.
Okay.
Fracture. But
how do you make that?
Huh?
What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean the good synthesizes true, moral, and beautiful. So those are the three parts that make up the whole, which is the good.
Okay.
I don't know. is probably similar to Neoplatonism, but I just when you put good down at the same level, it's like, well, then what's above it? I think the good is what's above it.
Right.
Does
And
that make
that's,
sense?
yeah, and that seems like a good making of that mean, like that's a good meaning to make out of that.
Okay, so I guess I probably have just one final question, just to get a little clarity. If we could subtract all the demonic religious baggage from the word evil, would you still have an issue with the word evil?
Oh, is that a non-starter? Because we can never subtract that meaning out of the word because it's already heavily laden with all that, thanks to thousands of
Oh,
years.
words evolve. Words evolve. Get 1,000 years past Christianity's extinction, I think evil will lose all of the demonic connotation.
Right. So it's not so much the demon anymore; it's the disgust mechanism response. I think is the problem there.
Okay,
So,
so you're worried about the disgust response.
and it's not so okay. So I should be careful with that word too. It's the insular cortex response, which involves disgust, but we
Mhm.
also want to use the anterior cortex, yeah, anterior insular cortex, which is how we reason about that and how we see good. And so it seems like the insular cortex is more prominent in the majority of brains. So the words that are existing in our cultures and across cultures that activate that insular cortex responses, those more tempt us towards outgrouping and excluding people and viewing people as less than, or the cockroaches. And it's the associations, like Wittgenstein talks about this too, associations of evil with the cockroach, with the lesser being, the grosser being, the possibly harmful and dangerous. Like that's also amygdala responses that are involved in that. That's so deep set in us that I think that just getting rid of the word altogether, or just not getting rid of it, but like questioning it. I'm also not promoting getting rid of the terms. This is what works for me. What I'm really getting at is this idea of just the mindfulness and the reframing of the terms and questioning when they serve you, and what to do with them when you use them. So you can use evil if you want. Anyone can. It's just you have to also match that with the immediate reframing of this misguidedness. And so I just say misguided. Like people are just, yeah, they're very
Yeah.
persuaded towards frameworks and ways of living that don't benefit them or others.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think I'll have to think on that a little bit more, see how I feel about that. I really appreciate hearing a different perspective that I think there's a lot of value to where you're coming from. So I definitely want to think about it a little bit more.
Right on. Also, I'll do the same because yeah, you really pushed me on this one. I think that's I, like when you go to think about this, I encourage people when I talk with them to think about this and question if I'm just playing language games, because that's kind of what I'm most worried about, is when we're picking and choosing, and when it goes from a useful form of reframing versus self-deception and just playing semantics on things. And so far,
Yeah.
like, over the past few years, I think that the power in questioning language that supersedes the whole language games semantics argument in the large majority of cases. Like, okay, so if I just say that's just not good, or like that's the not good thing, like that starts to sound like language games when I could just say that's bad. And I use the term bad. I think in those terms as well. But immediately when I go to think of bad as well, I am also gravitating more towards this privatio boni. Like this is the privation of what could be better. I guess is a better way to say that than just the privation of good. It's the privation of potential better.
Fair enough.
But yeah, man, uh, excellent talks, man. I love this when I have my philosophy's question on this. It's so useful. And
Oh, hell yeah. So we got the dialectic going right here, right now.
yes, sir. Yeah, it's good to see. And I want to encourage anyone listening to this to also put this into practice and indeed reflect on this fact that you can have these conversations without getting worked up about it or getting offended or whatever. Uh, it's to me what brings this about is indeed this whole nuance fact. Like I'm talking about this in the ether. Like these, I'm not attached to these ideas. I mean I am, and I live by this, and I guide myself by this. But in order to form a better understanding of myself in the world, I have to keep these thoughts out here in the ether and separate my emotions from the thoughts and the words that I'm using. If only we could employ that in Congress and politics, right?
Yeah. Don't get me depressed with that topic.
Word. All right, man. Well, we will pick this up again probably next week, and we'll continue how to live morally without free will.
Sweet. Take
Thanks.
care.